Hello, friend. Settle in, get comfortable. Because where we're headed tonight is a place most people think they already know, and by the end of this you'll realise you didn't. Not really. Just a small moment before we begin. If these quiet evenings have become a little habit of yours, subscribing would mean more than you know. And if tonight helps carry you off to sleep, a like really does keep me going. Tell me in the comments where you're tucked in tonight. Maybe a quiet bedroom in Manchester, or a cosy couch somewhere in Ohio. I read every single one, truly. All right, love, pull that blanket up. Let's begin. We're spending tonight inside the homes of New York City. The year is 1900, and something about this particular year kept pulling at me the deeper I researched it. There's one fact I want to hand you right away, because it's the thing that made me sit back from my screen the first time I read it. So let me set it up properly. By 1900, the truth is, New York wasn't really one city at all. It was several cities, layered on top of one another, breathing the same air, rained on by the same storms, reading the same morning papers, and sharing almost nothing else between them. Walk through the Lower East Side that year, and you'd find a particular style of building rising on nearly every block, one its own architects had nicknamed, without a trace of irony, the dumbbell tenement. The reason becomes obvious the second you see the blueprint from above. The structure squeezes inward at its centre, slim as a waistline, then flares out wide at the front and rear, the exact silhouette of the cast iron weights stacked in any gymnasium of that decade. That narrowing wasn't there for looks. It existed purely to satisfy the smallest legal requirement a city law allowed, a sliver of open space wedged between one building and its neighbour, just barely enough to technically count as access to light and air for every room inside. What that gap actually became, in practice, was closer to a vertical dumping ground, a shaft where ash and spoiled food and, every now and then, a dead animal would simply vanish downward, while the air trapped inside it climbed past floor after floor after floor, hundreds of apartments stacked along a single column of stagnant, foul space. A family living on the top floor might crack open their only window facing that shaft hoping for sunlight. Mostly what drifted in instead was everyone else's cooking, waste and rot rising up to meet them. Here's the detail that I still can't quite shake though. Barely 3 miles away, on that exact same afternoon, a very different New Yorker might be standing in her bedroom on Fifth Avenue, caught up in a far smaller decision, which of two nearly matching closets to choose from, given that this house alone holds more closets than her childhood home held entire rooms. Her actual dilemma that day has nothing to do with air or space or light at all. It's simply which shade of morning dress best matches that particular grey sky outside. Two lives separated by centuries of difference, just 3 miles of pavement apart on the very same Tuesday. And that distance, I think, is really what tonight's story is about. I want to walk you through both of those worlds tonight, slowly, properly, hour by hour, exactly as they were lived, not the version that ends up in postcards or period dramas. So let's leave the year we're sitting in right now and go find out what that morning actually felt like. Let your shoulders drop an inch or two from wherever they have been holding tension all day. Good. Now let us go back. It is 5 o'clock in the morning, the last week of February, 1902. The sky over Manhattan has not yet decided whether it belongs to night or day, and on Hester Street, on the 5th floor of a tenement with no name except the number painted crookedly above its door, a woman named Sadie is already awake. She did not set an alarm. There were no alarm clocks in this apartment, not the kind you could buy ready-made anyway, and even if there had been, she would not have needed one. Her body has learned the hour the way a body learns anything it cannot afford to forget. Sadie is 28 years old. She came to New York 4 years ago from a small town outside of Minsk, a place she almost never talks about now, not because the memory pains her, though it does, a little, but because there simply is not time in a day like the one ahead of her to spend on memory. She has a husband, Morris, who presses garments in a shop 2 blocks away for 11 hours a day, 6 days a week, and 3 children. Hyman is 12, Esther is 9, Dora is not quite 2, and she is, at this exact moment, the only person in the apartment who is still fully asleep, curled into the crook of her mother's side in the bed that Sadie and Morris and Dora all share, in the one room of the apartment that has a window facing the actual street. I want you to picture the apartment itself for a moment, because the geography of it matters enormously to everything that follows. It is what people of the time simply called a railroad flat, on account of the rooms running one into the next like train cars, no hallway connecting them, no way to reach the kitchen at the back without walking straight through the middle room, which has no window at all, none, and which the family uses as a bedroom for Hyman and Esther, because what else would you use a windowless room for? The front room, the one with the street-facing window, is where Sadie and Morris sleep, and it doubles in the daytime as the room where visitors are received, on the rare occasion that there is time to receive anyone. The kitchen at the back has the only other window, the one that opens onto the air shaft I just described to you, the one that is more decorative than functional for actual light. 400 square feet. That is roughly the total space this family of 5 occupies, and they are not unusual. They are, if anything, slightly better off than some of their neighbours, because Morris's wages as a presser are steady, even if they are not generous, and because they have managed, through a combination of luck and Sadie's relentless calculation, to avoid taking in a boarder the way so many families on their floor do, renting out a corner of the kitchen floor to a single man for a few dollars a month just to make the rent. Sadie slides out from under the quilt without waking Dora, a small miracle she performs every single morning through a combination of practice and prayer. The room is cold. Not uncomfortably cold in the way a person from a heated modern apartment might imagine, but cold in the specific bone-deep way of a New York February with no central heat of any kind, just the memory of yesterday's stove warmth, long since faded into the plaster. She can see her breath, faintly, in the grey light. She pulls a shawl around her shoulders over her nightclothes and walks, barefoot, across floorboards that creak in places she has long since memorized, into the kitchen. The stove is the first thing she touches, and the first thing she has to fight with. It is a small coal-burning range, cast iron, squat and stubborn, and it has gone completely cold overnight, the way it does every night, because coal is not cheap, and nobody in this apartment can justify feeding the stove through the dark hours just to keep it lit. Lighting it again each morning is its own small ritual of frustration. She opens the firebox, clears out yesterday's ash into a pail with a small metal scoop, and the ash gets everywhere, the way ash does. A fine grey dust that settles into the creases of her hands and under her fingernails, no matter how careful she tries to be. She lays in kindling first, whatever scraps of wood she has saved through the week, a few twists of old newspaper, and then the coal itself, and she strikes a match with hands that are, if I am honest with you, already a little numb from the cold. It does not light on the first try. It almost never does. She has to coax it, feeding air in through the damper, watching the kindling catch and then nearly die, and then catch again. And there is a particular kind of patience required here that I think we have mostly lost in a world where heat simply arrives at the turn of a knob. Sadie does not think of it as patience. She thinks of it, if she thinks of it at all, as Tuesday. While the stove fights its way towards something resembling warmth, she has another task waiting, and this one requires leaving the apartment entirely. There is no running water inside this apartment. None. Not in the kitchen, not anywhere. The closest water comes from a tap in the rear yard, 5 flights down, shared by every family in the building, which on this particular block means something close to 30 families, more than 150 people, drawing from the same handful of spigots. Sadie takes the 2 empty pails sitting by the kitchen door, the same 2 pails she's carried up and down these stairs every single morning for 4 years, and she goes down. 5 flights. The stairwell is unlit at this hour, narrow, and smells the way old wood and coal smoke and too many cooking meals over too many years will eventually smell. A smell that has worked itself permanently into the walls. She knows the stairs by feel, the worn-down centre of each tread, the loose board on the 3rd landing that she has learned to step around without thinking. At the bottom, in the rear yard, there are already 2 other women waiting their turn at the tap, exchanging a few quiet words in Yiddish about the cold, about a sick child on the 4th floor, about nothing in particular, The kind of small talk that exists specifically to make an unpleasant task feel slightly less unpleasant. She fills both pails. Full, they are heavy, heavier than you would think looking at them, and she carries them back up the same 5 flights she just came down, one in each hand, her arms straining, stopping once on the 3rd floor landing to rest for just a moment before continuing. This is not a special chore reserved for laundry day or some occasion. This is every single morning and likely another trip or 2 before the day is finished, because water is needed for cooking and washing and rinsing, and a dozen invisible small uses that a modern household does not think about, because the water simply arrives, silent, through a pipe, whenever it is wanted. By the time Sadie gets the water back up to the kitchen, the stove has finally caught properly, throwing a thin orange light against the cast iron and beginning, slowly, to push back against the cold of the room. She sets a pot of the water on top to heat. Tea first, then porridge for the children, oatmeal mostly, sometimes with a little milk if the milkman's prices have been kind that week, and bread that she bought yesterday from the bakery on the corner. The loaf already a day old and a little harder than it was yesterday morning, though nobody in this apartment is in a position to be particular about that. 3 miles north, at almost exactly the same hour, a different kind of morning is beginning, though calling it morning for the woman at the centre of it would be technically premature. Augusta Lathrop is still asleep, and will remain asleep for nearly 2 more hours, in a bedroom on the 3rd floor of a house on 5th Avenue near 54th Street. A house with a limestone front and a number of rooms that even Augusta herself sometimes has to think about before stating with confidence. But someone in this house has already been awake for some time, and that someone is Bridget, who is 24 years old, who came over from County Clare 6 years ago, and who is, as of this winter, Augusta's lady's maid. Bridget rose at 5:30, in a small room on the 4th floor she shares with no one, a privilege she's aware not every servant in the city enjoys, and she has already done a number of things before Augusta has so much as stirred under her quilted silk coverlet 2 floors below. She has, for one thing, already been down to the kitchen and back, where the cook, Mrs. Hennessy, has the great iron range roaring by 5 in the morning every single day of the year, a range so much larger than the one Sadie fights with on Hester Street that it would not be unreasonable to call them different species of object entirely, though they share a name and distantly a function. Bridget carried up a small can of hot water, not for cooking, but specifically for washing, set it beside the basin in Augusta's dressing room, and is now laying out the morning's first dress across the bed, smoothing invisible wrinkles from fabric that cost more per yard than Morris the presser earns in a week. I want to pause here, because this is usually the point where people get the wrong idea about what a morning like this actually involves. We imagine Augusta floating awake whenever she pleases, ringing a little bell, and being waited on in a kind of luxurious haze that requires nothing of her at all. The truth, once you look closely, is considerably stranger than that. Augusta's day, when it begins, will be scheduled to something close to the 1/4 hour, written out the previous evening in a small leather book that sits on her writing desk, and the schedule does not exist because anyone forces it on her. It exists because the entire architecture of her social position depends on her managing an extraordinary number of moving pieces correctly, and failing to do so has consequences that, while different in kind from a tenement family's consequences, are not nothing. There is a particular kind of work involved in appearing to do no work at all, and we're going to spend a good portion of tonight pulling that work into the light, because it has been almost entirely invisible for more than 100 years, hidden behind the very success of its own performance. Bridget moves to the window and draws back the heavy curtain just enough to judge the light outside, still grey, still early, and then crosses to check the small coal grate in the corner of the dressing room, which has been kept lit through the night by the houseboy whose job, among many other jobs, is exactly this, to make sure no fire in this house ever goes fully cold the way Sadie's stove does every single night 3 miles south. The Lathrop house burns through an extraordinary quantity of coal in a winter, far more than most New Yorkers will burn in a decade, delivered by the cartload to a chute at the side of the house, and shoveled by a man whose entire job, it sometimes seems, exists to make sure that warmth in this house is never a question anyone has to think about. That is, I think, one of the cleanest ways to describe the difference between these two worlds. In one of them, heat is a daily battle fought freshly every morning with kindling and matches and cold fingers. In the other, heat is simply assumed, the way air is assumed, a background condition of existence so reliable that nobody in the household above the level of the servants gives it a single conscious thought from 1 month to the next. Augusta wakes at 7:15, not because anything wakes her exactly, but because her body, much like Sadie's, has been trained by years of routine into a kind of internal clock. She lies for a moment in the grey morning light filtering through curtains that Bridget has by now opened fully, running through the day ahead the way a general might review the order of an upcoming battle. There is a morning call she is expected to receive. There is a luncheon she is hosting for 11 women, whose good opinion matters to her husband's business in ways that are never spoken aloud, but are nonetheless entirely real. There are 2 afternoon calls she must pay herself in person, leaving cards if the lady of the house is not receiving, which is its own elaborate social code we will get into properly later tonight. There is a fitting at her dressmaker at 3, and there is a dinner this evening for 16, at the home of a couple Augusta needs, quite badly, to like her. A day like today has no real room in it for improvisation. Slip one piece and the rest of the structure shifts. She rings a small bell on the table beside her bed, and Bridget appears within minutes, already dressed, already composed, carrying the warmed water and a pressed dressing gown. This is the moment, I think, where the comparison between these two households becomes almost uncomfortably clear, and I want to sit with it honestly rather than rushing past it, because there is no version of tonight's story that is fair to anyone if we pretend the gap between these two mornings was small. It was not small. It was enormous, and both of the women at the centre of it, Sadie hauling water up 5 flights of stairs, and Augusta extending her hand to receive a cup of chocolate brought up on a small tray, would have found the other's morning almost impossible to imagine in any concrete detail. And yet, here is something I want you to hold on to, because we are going to come back to it more than once tonight. Neither woman in the actual texture of her day would have described her own morning as easy. Sadie's morning is a battle against cold and distance and time, fought with her hands and her back. Augusta's morning is a battle against a different enemy entirely, against the constant possibility of a misstep, a wrong word, a dress chosen incorrectly for the weather, a guest seated wrong at a table, any one of 100 invisible rules whose violation could cost her something real in a social world where reputation functioned, in its own way, almost like currency. Different battles, different weapons, both of them in their own way exhausting by the time the sun goes down. Augusta's chocolate arrives on a small silver tray carried up by a footman whose name is Thomas, 20 years old, who has been with the household for 8 months, and whose entire job for this portion of the morning consists of carrying things up and down stairs that he is not permitted to use the same way the family does. There is a separate staircase for servants in this house, narrow, plain, unornamented, running parallel to the grand staircase the family uses, and the 2 staircases almost never intersect except at the points where a servant must briefly cross into the family's space to deliver something, perform some task, and then disappear again, as completely as possible, back into the part of the house that exists, structurally and architecturally, to be invisible. This is, by the way, one of the genuinely strange and quietly fascinating features of houses built for the very wealthy at the turn of the century. They were not simply large, they were engineered with real architectural intention to allow an enormous amount of human labour to happen constantly, ceaselessly, within feet of the family at almost every moment, while remaining functionally unseen. Servants' staircases, hidden doors disguised as panelling, service corridors running behind the walls of formal rooms, The entire point was that a meal should simply appear perfectly timed, perfectly arranged, as though produced by something close to magic, with every trace of the actual labour, the sweat, the burns, the exhaustion, scrubbed from view before it ever reached the family's eyes. Back on Hester Street there is no such architecture, because there is no such illusion to maintain. Sadie's labour is not hidden from anyone, least of all from Sadie. It happens in full view, in the same 400 square feet where her family eats and sleeps and exists, because there is nowhere else for it to happen, and no one whose job it is to make it disappear. In the kitchen on Hester Street, the porridge is nearly ready, and Sadie has to wake the children, which on most mornings is its own small negotiation. Hyman, at 12, sleeps the deep, almost unwakeable sleep of a boy who is up before dawn most days anyway, because he sells newspapers on a corner near Grand Street before school starts, has done so for almost 2 years now, and contributes the few coins he earns to the household, with a seriousness that always strikes Sadie as slightly too old for his age, though she has never told him so. Esther wakes more easily, 9 years old and naturally an early riser, already half-dressed by the time her mother calls a second time, pulling a worn wool stocking over one foot while balancing on the other in a way that makes Sadie smile despite the cold, despite the hour, despite everything. Morris is the last one up, not from laziness but because his hours at the pressing shop run so late into the evening, sometimes past 8, that the household has long since adjusted its rhythms around the simple fact that he needs every possible minute of sleep he can get. He works with an iron that weighs something close to 15 pounds, heated on a gas ring at the shop, pressed down again and again over finished garments for 11 hours at a stretch. And his hands, Sadie has noticed without ever quite saying it aloud, have started to look older than the rest of him. He eats his porridge standing, mostly, moving between the table and the door, pulling on a coat that has been mended at both elbows, and by 5:45 he is gone, down the same 5 flights of stairs Sadie climbed twice already this morning, out into a street that is even at this hour beginning to fill with carts and pushcarts and other men walking the same direction toward the same kinds of shops, a whole neighbourhood's worth of human beings converging on roughly the same handful of trades, garment work mostly, pressing, cutting, sewing, finishing, the needle trades as people call them, the engine that runs most of this particular stretch of the city. Hyman leaves a few minutes after his father, his bundle of papers already arranged for him by an older boy who runs the corner where he sells, and Esther leaves for school not long after that, walking with 2 other girls from the building, their breath visible in the cold morning air, their shoes, all 3 pairs, showing some degree of wear at the toe that none of their mothers can currently afford to fully repair, which leaves Sadie alone with Dora, and a day that has not even properly started yet, though by any reasonable accounting she has already been working for 2.5 hours. I want to tell you about laundry now, because laundry, more than almost anything else, is the chore that defines the texture of a week in a household like this one, and most people today have genuinely no concept of what it actually involved. Today happens to be a Monday, which in nearly every working-class household in New York at this time means one thing, and one thing only: wash day. There is no washing machine in this apartment, obviously, and there will not be one for decades. There is a galvanized tin tub, the same tub the family uses for bathing, repurposed for laundry on this particular morning, and there is a washboard, ridged metal set into a wooden frame, and there is an enormous quantity of water that has to be hauled, heated, used, and then hauled away again, all of it by hand, all of it by Sadie, working alone in a kitchen that will be filled by mid-morning with so much steam that the one window, the airshaft window, will be completely fogged over. She makes several more trips to the yard for water this morning, beyond the 2 she already made, because washing requires far more water than drinking and cooking combined. Each trip is the same 5 flights down, the same wait at the tap if other women are already there, the same 5 flights back up, heavier this time because the pails are full. By the time she has enough water for a proper wash, her arms are trembling slightly with the effort, a tremor she has learned to simply work through rather than acknowledge. The water has to be heated on the stove in batches because the stove cannot heat enough water all at once for the volume she needs, which means the whole process happens in stages. A pot heated, poured into the tub, used for one portion of the wash, while the next pot begins heating, and so on, for hours. She scrubs each garment against the ridged surface of the washboard, working soap, a hard yellow bar she shaves into flakes herself, into the fabric, focusing especially on the collars and cuffs of Morris's work shirts, which by the end of a week of 11-hour days are stained through with sweat and a particular grime of a pressing shop, a combination of starch dust and machine grease that does not come out easily no matter how hard she scrubs. Her knuckles, by the end of a wash day, are raw, sometimes cracked, and there is a particular smell that settles over the whole apartment on a Monday, a mixture of wet wool and lye soap and the steam itself, that Sadie has stopped noticing the way you stop noticing any smell that has become simply the smell of your own life. When the washing itself is finished, there is the wringing, done entirely by hand because there is no wringer in this apartment, twisting each garment as hard as her arms will allow to push out as much water as possible before hanging it. And here is where the geography of the tenement creates one more small daily problem to solve. There is no yard space worth speaking of, certainly nothing like a private garden, so laundry gets hung either across the air shaft on lines strung from window to window, a system every family on this side of the building participates in and silently negotiates around the others, or, weather permitting, on the roof, 5 flights up from the apartment itself, meaning Sadie will make yet another trip up and down these same stairs, this time carrying a full basket of wet, heavy laundry to hang it where it has any reasonable chance of actually drying. On a good day, with decent weather, the wash will be dry by evening. On a bad day, in genuine winter cold, it might not dry at all, and the apartment will fill instead with damp garments hung indoors near the stove, adding yet another layer of moisture to air that is already thick with cooking smells and coal smoke, and the particular dampness of 5 other apartments worth of laundry steam rising up through that same narrow shaft. This is one wash day. There will be another one next Monday, and the Monday after that, for as long as Sadie is alive and capable of standing at a tub, because this is simply what a week is in a household like this one, in this particular slice of New York City in the year 1900. Laundry happens in the Lathrop house too, of course, on this very same Monday, because Monday is wash day across nearly the entire city regardless of which century a household happens to be living in. But it happens completely out of sight, 3 floors below where Augusta is currently deciding between 2 morning dresses, in a basement laundry room equipped with a built-in copper boiler, a mechanical wringer that operates by turning a hand crank rather than by the raw strength of someone's bare arms, and a drying room heated by its own dedicated stove specifically so that wet linens never have to hang indoors among the family's living spaces or compete with the unpredictable New York weather at all. The laundress, a woman named Margaret Doyle, no relation to the housekeeper despite sharing a name, who began at 6 this morning and will likely still be working at 6 this evening, handles an almost unimaginable volume of fabric every week, sheets for every bed in the house, of which there are 11, tablecloths large enough to seat 16 people, several of which get used and need cleaning multiple times in a single week if the social calendar is heavy, the family's undergarments, which for a woman like Augusta means an extraordinary quantity of fine linen and lawn cotton, that must be handled with considerably more care than Morris's work shirts, soaked rather than scrubbed hard, treated gently to preserve delicate stitching and lace trim that would tear under the kind of vigorous scrubbing Sadie applies to coal-stained collars 3 miles south. It is in its own way just as physical a job as the one Sadie performs alone in her kitchen, just as hard on the hands and the back, conducted in a basement room thick with the same steam and the same smell of lye soap. The difference, and it is an enormous difference even though the raw physical labour involved is not so different in kind, is that Margaret Doyle is paid a wage for this work, goes home to her own rooms at the end of it, and will never, under any circumstance, be expected to also cook the family's dinner, or mend their stockings, or mind anyone's children in the hours between. Her labour is specialised, contained, and entirely separate from the rest of the household's functioning, which is precisely the kind of division of labour that a household with 11 indoor servants can afford to construct, and precisely the kind of division of labour that a household of 5 sharing 400 square feet simply cannot. Upstairs, Augusta has settled on the grey wool walking dress rather than the lighter morning gown, partly because of the cold, and partly, if she is honest with herself, because grey suits a complexion that has been looking a touch tired this week, a small private vanity she would never admit to anyone, not even Bridget, though Bridget almost certainly already knows it anyway, the way a good lady's maid comes to know nearly everything about her mistress over time, including things the mistress has never said out loud. Getting dressed, for Augusta, is not a private 5-minute affair the way it might be for you or me. It is a process conducted with Bridget's direct and constant assistance, beginning with undergarments most people today have never even seen, layer after layer of fine cotton and linen, a corset laced from behind with Bridget's fingers working quickly and expertly along a row of small metal hooks and eyes, pulled snug but, in this particular household at this particular hour of the morning, not painfully so. There is a popular modern image of Victorian and Edwardian corsetry as a kind of daily torture device, and there is some truth buried in that image, certainly for women whose mothers or fashionable friends pushed extreme tight lacing for the sake of an exaggerated silhouette, but for a woman like Augusta, practical, busy, with an actual day of real activity ahead of her, the corset functions more as a kind of structural undergarment, providing posture and support the way certain pieces of modern shapewear still do, uncomfortable in the way any firm garment is uncomfortable, but rarely the cartoonish suffocation device of popular imagination. Over the corset comes a corset cover, then a petticoat, then a second petticoat for warmth given the season, and only then the dress itself, which Bridget lifts carefully over Augusta's head and arranges, buttoning a long row of small fabric-covered buttons running down the back, more buttons than either woman has ever bothered to count, adjusting the fall of the skirt, checking the line of the sleeve at the shoulder. The whole process, beginning to end, takes perhaps 25 minutes, and this is merely the first dressing of the day. There will very likely be at least one more change before evening, possibly 2 depending on how the schedule unfolds, because different activities in this world require different costumes the way different scenes in a play require different sets, and arriving at a luncheon in the same dress worn for a morning walk would read. To the women gathered there, as a small but real social misstep, hair comes next, and this too is Bridget's work, not Augusta's, brushed out, pinned, arranged into the kind of soft, structured shape fashionable that particular winter, a process that involves a surprising number of pins, an entire small drawer of them in fact, and a degree of skill that took Bridget the better part of 2 years to fully master after she first came into service. By the time Augusta descends to the breakfast room, it is nearly 9, considerably later than Sadie's household has been awake and working, and this gap in timing is, I think, worth sitting with for a moment, because it is not laziness on Augusta's part. Not exactly, even though it might look that way at first glance. It reflects something more structural about how each household's day is organized around the demands actually placed on it. Sadie's morning begins early because cold and hunger and a husband's work schedule do not wait. Augusta's morning begins later because the activities that fill her day, social calls, correspondence, the management of a household staff, simply do not require the same urgency before the sun has properly risen, and because there are quite literally other people in the house whose entire job is to make sure everything that does need to happen early has already happened by the time she comes downstairs. Charles Lathrop, her husband, has already breakfasted and left for his office downtown by the time Augusta sits down at the breakfast table, which strikes some people as a small sadness when they first hear it, the idea that husband and wife in this kind of household might routinely not even share a morning meal, though Augusta herself has never thought of it that way. Their lives in this particular era and this particular social class run on largely parallel tracks that intersect at dinner, at social engagements, and in conversations snatched in the brief windows between, rather than constantly overlapping the way two people sharing 400 square feet of space are, quite simply forced to overlap whether they want to or not. Her two children, Edmund, who is 10, and Beatrice, who is 7, eat their own breakfast separately as well, in the nursery on the floor above, under the supervision of their governess, a quietly formidable Englishwoman named Miss Carrow, and Augusta will see them, on a typical day, for perhaps an hour total, a window in the late afternoon set aside specifically and deliberately for that purpose, plus a brief visit to say goodnight. This too strikes modern listeners as strange, sometimes even cold, when they first encounter it, and I want to be careful here not to flatten the complexity of what this actually meant for women like Augusta. It was not generally an absence of love, it was an entirely different cultural model of what a mother's role even was, one inherited from generations of aristocratic and upper-class European tradition, in which raising children day to day was understood as skilled labor best delegated to a trained specialist, while the mother's role was something closer to overseeing the whole operation from a slight distance, shaping character and values during carefully bounded windows of direct contact, rather than through the constant, exhausting, minute-by-minute presence that defines parenting in a household like Sadie's, where there is no governess, no nursery, no possibility of delegation, and where Dora simply exists within arm's reach of her mother at every moment of every single day, because there is, quite literally, nowhere else for her to be and no one else available to mind her. Back on Hester Street, the wash is hung more or less strung across the air shaft on a line that Sadie shares, by long-standing informal agreement, with the family one floor below. And now there is a second job waiting for her, one that does not stop simply because laundry day exists: piecework. A great many women in this neighborhood, Sadie among them, supplement the household income by taking in sewing from a contractor, a man who distributes bundles of unfinished garments to women working from their own kitchens and collects the finished pieces a few days later, paying by the piece rather than by the hour. Sadie finishes sleeves, mostly, attaching them to bodices already cut and partially assembled at the shop, a task that requires real skill and a steady hand, but pays by the dozen an amount that would seem almost insultingly small to anyone unfamiliar with how tight these margins really run. She works at the kitchen table whenever Dora allows it, which is not always, snatching 20 minutes here, 40 minutes there, the work interrupted constantly by the demands of a toddler who has no understanding whatsoever of deadlines or contractors or the family's narrow financial margins, and reasonably so, because she is not yet 2 years old. This is the part of a tenement Mother's Day that is almost entirely invisible in most historical accounts because it happened quietly, at kitchen tables fitted into the cracks of an already overloaded schedule, and because the women doing it rarely thought to record it themselves, too busy actually doing it to write about it. But economists who have studied the period estimate that piecework income from women like Sadie made up a genuinely significant portion of total household earnings in immigrant neighborhoods across the Lower East Side, sometimes the difference between a family that could just barely make rent and one that fell behind and faced eviction, a threat that hung over households like this one, with a constancy that is difficult to fully convey. Midday brings another necessary task, and that is food, specifically the question of what the family will eat for the evening meal, since there is no real refrigeration to speak of in this apartment, just a small icebox that holds perhaps a day's worth of perishables if Sadie has been able to afford a block of ice that week, which is not every week. Shopping, for a household like this one, happens nearly daily rather than weekly, partly because of the lack of cold storage, and partly because there is simply no spare cash to buy in bulk, even when bulk buying would, in theory, save money over time. Sadie takes Dora with her, the child balanced on one hip, down to Hester Street and the pushcart market that fills the block with an almost overwhelming density of vendors, men and women shouting prices in 3 or 4 languages at once, selling herring out of barrels, root vegetables stacked in uneven pyramids, live chickens in wooden crates for anyone willing to do their own slaughtering at home, second-hand clothing, pots and pans, ribbon, buttons, nearly anything a household might conceivably need, sold from carts wheeled into position before dawn and wheeled away again after dark. An entire informal economy operating in the open street because none of these vendors could afford, or in many cases legally obtain, an actual storefront. She buys potatoes, a little onion, a small piece of meat from a kosher butcher 2 streets over, careful, as always, about which vendors' prices have crept up this week and which have not, conducting a kind of constant mental arithmetic that never fully switches off, because every single penny in this household is accounted for before it is ever spent, and a miscalculation in February could mean a genuine hardship in March. Cooking, when she returns, happens entirely on that same small coal stove, the same one she fought to light at 5 in the morning, now needing to be fed and managed all over again for the midday and evening meals, its single oven barely large enough for a modest pot of stew, certainly not large enough for the kind of baking many families would prefer to do themselves, which is part of why so many households in this neighborhood rely on the corner bakery not just for bread but for entire dishes, a pot of beans or a casserole, brought to the bakery in the late afternoon to be baked overnight in the bakery's enormous, still warm ovens after the day's bread has come out, retrieved the next morning for a few pennies, a small informal arrangement that exists specifically because individual tenement kitchens simply cannot do what a commercial oven can. There is one more detail about this apartment I have not mentioned yet, and I think it matters. Down the hall, shared between this apartment and the one next door, meaning shared among roughly 8 or 9 people total, is a single water closet, a relatively recent improvement over the yard privies that older tenements on this same block still rely on, installed only because newer housing laws passed at the very end of the previous century required it. It is not heated, it is not private in any meaningful sense beyond a simple latch on the door, and it is, by any reasonable measure, still an enormous improvement over what existed before, which tells you something honestly remarkable about just how low the previous baseline really was. Bathing happens once a week in this household, generally Saturday evening in preparation for the Sabbath, in the same tin tub used for laundry, filled with water heated in stages on the stove exactly the way the wash water was heated, the whole family taking turns in sequence, generally youngest to oldest, in water that grows steadily less hot and considerably less clean with each successive turn. This is not a detail meant to shock you. It was simply normal, understood by everyone in this building and this neighborhood as the ordinary shape of a week, and Sadie has never once in 4 years in this apartment thought of it as deprivation exactly. It is simply what a bath is in this particular life on this particular street. There are 4 bathrooms in the Lathrop house, a number that would have struck most New Yorkers of the period, even fairly comfortable ones, as faintly absurd, and each one is supplied with genuinely hot water on demand, heated by a coal-fired boiler in the basement that runs more or less continuously and is tended by a man whose entire job, alongside several others, is making sure that boiler never fails. Augusta has never in her life carried a pail of water up a staircase, has never lit a fire to heat bath water, has, if she is honest, never given the actual mechanics of hot water a single thought in her 34 years of life, the way most of us never think about where electricity comes from until the moment it stops arriving. The house is lit partly by gas and, in a handful of the most important rooms, the parlour and the dining room specifically, by electricity, which was installed 2 years ago at not inconsiderable expense and remains even now something of a novelty that Charles enjoys mentioning to guests. The wiring run carefully behind walls by men who specialised in exactly this kind of installation in exactly this kind of house, since most of the city, including most of the wealthy parts of the city, still relied on gas in the year 1900. There is something almost touching about it if you think about it the right way. The same decade that gave the Lathrop parlour its first electric bulbs gave Sadie's kitchen its first indoor water closet down the hall. progress in this period moved in extremely uneven waves, arriving in wildly different forms depending entirely on which rung of the ladder you happen to be standing on. After breakfast, Augusta spends close to an hour at her writing desk, a task that occupies a genuinely substantial portion of her week, and that almost nobody today appreciates as the labor it actually was. Correspondence in this world is not casual. There are notes to write accepting or declining invitations, each one composed with careful attention to tone and phrasing, because a poorly worded reply could be read by a sensitive recipient as a small social slight. There are thank you notes to compose for a dinner attended 2 evenings ago, expected within a precise and unspoken window of time, generally no more than a day or two, after which a delay itself becomes a kind of statement. There is a letter to her sister in Boston, genuinely personal, genuinely warm, one of the few pieces of correspondence in her morning that feels less like an obligation and more like an actual conversation with someone she loves. And there is the question of calling cards, an entire social system built around small rectangles of stiff paper printed with a woman's name, which functioned in this period as something between a polite greeting and a formal credential. The rules governing them were extensive and largely unwritten, absorbed rather than taught directly, the kind of knowledge a woman like Augusta acquired gradually over years of careful observation of her own mother and the women around her. A first call after moving to a new neighborhood, a returned call within a specific window of days, the exact number varying slightly depending on the relative social standing of the two households involved. A card left with one corner turned down to indicate the call was made in person rather than sent by a servant. An entire silent language conducted through paper and timing, and Augusta is fluent in it the way she is fluent in nothing else quite so completely, because fluency in precisely this language is in a very real sense the actual skill her entire upbringing was designed to produce. At 11, she receives a morning call from 2 women, the wife of a business associate of Charles's and her unmarried sister, and the visit lasts exactly the correct length, somewhere between 15 and 25 minutes, long enough to be courteous, short enough to avoid overstaying, conducted in the front parlour over a small cup of chocolate brought in by Thomas the footman and poured by Augusta herself, because pouring is one of the small handful of domestic acts a hostess of her standing is actually expected to perform with her own hands, a tiny deliberate gesture of personal warmth inserted into an otherwise heavily mediated social occasion. Luncheon today is smaller than the major social events scheduled for later in the week, just Augusta and 3 friends, but it is still, by any ordinary household standard, an elaborate undertaking. Mrs. Hennessy, the cook, has been planning the menu since the previous afternoon. A clear soup to begin, a delicate fish course, a small portion of roasted fowl with vegetables arranged with real visual care on the plate, and a light dessert, the whole sequence designed to be substantial enough to satisfy without being so heavy that it would derail an afternoon that still includes calls to be paid and a dressmaker's fitting. Below stairs, the kitchen during the lead-up to a meal like this one operates with a level of choreography that would not look entirely out of place in a professional restaurant, which in a sense it essentially is, just one with a single permanent, extremely demanding customer. There is Mrs. Hennessy herself, who has cooked professionally for nearly 20 years and commands the kitchen with an authority that even Augusta, technically her employer, generally chooses not to challenge on matters of actual cooking. There is a kitchen maid whose job consists largely of the unglamorous preparatory work, scrubbing vegetables, plucking and dressing the fowl, washing an apparently endless quantity of pots and pans, work that mirrors in its raw physical drudgery quite a lot of what Sadie does alone in her own kitchen, except performed here by someone other than the woman who will actually eat the meal for a wage, within a strict division of household labour that simply has no equivalent on Hester Street. For larger dinners, particularly anything approaching the scale of the 16-guest dinner planned for later this week, the household will bring in additional help entirely, sometimes a French chef hired specifically for the occasion, a practice common enough among households at this level that there existed by this point agencies in the city specializing in exactly this kind of temporary culinary staffing. The French chef commands enormous respect and a correspondingly enormous fee, often more for a single evening's work than Mrs. Hennessy earns in a month, a hierarchy of culinary prestige that mirrors, in its own way, the hierarchy of social prestige running through the entire world Augusta moves in, where French taste, French fashion, French manners function as a kind of universally recognized currency of sophistication that no amount of homegrown American skill, however genuine, can quite match in the eyes of this particular social set. Let me tell you about the children now, because I think the contrast between how childhood itself was constructed in these two households reveals almost as much as anything we have looked at so far. Esther, at 9 years old, attends a public school a few blocks from the apartment, a crowded building where a single classroom might hold 50 or 60 children, sometimes more, taught by a teacher whose job, in a neighborhood like this one, involves not just arithmetic and reading, but something closer to basic cultural translation, since a meaningful portion of her students arrived in this country speaking little or no English at all. Esther herself is fully bilingual now, slipping between Yiddish at home and English at school, with the easy fluency of a child who has simply absorbed both languages the way children absorb anything they are surrounded by. Consistently enough, she likes school genuinely, in a way that sometimes surprises her mother given how exhausted she is most evenings, sitting at the kitchen table doing arithmetic by the light of a single kerosene lamp, because the gas has not been extended to this part of the building, and the family cannot afford to keep a lamp burning longer than strictly necessary. There is something in Esther, a sharpness that her teacher has commented on more than once, that makes Sadie privately hope, in a way she has never said aloud to anyone, that her daughter might someday do something other than piecework and laundry, though what exactly that something might look like remains, for now, a vague and mostly unspoken hope rather than any kind of concrete plan. Hyman's relationship to school is more complicated, because Hyman is 12, and 12 in a household like this one sits at an uncomfortable hinge point between childhood and the genuine economic expectations of an adult contributor. He still attends school most days, but his newspaper selling in the early morning and again for an hour after school lets out is not treated by anyone in the family as a hobby or a character-building exercise. It is income, modest but real, and there will very likely come a point within the next year or two, sooner if the family's finances tighten further, when Hyman leaves school altogether to work full-time, a transition that happened at this point in the city's history to an enormous number of boys his age across the immigrant neighborhoods of Manhattan, treated by most families not as a tragedy exactly, simply as the ordinary and expected shape of growing up poor in a crowded city. There are settlement houses scattered through this neighborhood, institutions founded by reform-minded, often wealthier New Yorkers specifically to address some of these conditions, offering classes, clubs, a clean place for children to spend an afternoon away from crowded apartments and unsupervised streets. Esther attends a sewing class at one of them on Thursday afternoons, taught, in something of a quiet irony given everything we have just discussed about Augusta's world, by a volunteer who is herself a woman of considerable means, motivated by a genuine, if sometimes imperfectly informed, sense of social obligation toward the neighborhood's children. These two worlds, Hester Street and Fifth Avenue, are not actually as separate as they might first appear. They touch here and there through exactly this kind of reform-minded volunteering, through charity, through the occasional newspaper article that crosses from one world's breakfast table into the other's drawing room conversation. Up on Fifth Avenue, Edmund and Beatrice spend their mornings in the nursery schoolroom under Miss Carrow's supervision, a space set apart specifically for this purpose, with its own small desks, its own shelf of carefully chosen books, its own globe standing in the corner that Edmund likes to spin when he thinks no one is watching closely enough to scold him for it. Their education here is considerably more individualized than anything available to Esther. Lessons tailored specifically to each child's pace and aptitude, French conversation practiced daily because fluency in French is considered, in households like this one, not an optional accomplishment but something close to a basic requirement for eventual entry into adult society. alongside penmanship, basic arithmetic, geography, and for Beatrice specifically, the beginnings of piano instruction from a music master who comes to the house twice a week. There is no equivalent in Edmund and Beatrice's daily experience of Hyman selling papers on a cold corner before school, no expectation whatsoever that either child will contribute financially to the household in any way, an idea that would strike Charles Lathrop, if anyone were foolish enough to suggest it to him, as faintly bizarre. Their entire childhood is constructed, with real and deliberate intention, as a kind of extended preparation period, years spent acquiring the accomplishments, manners, and social fluency that will eventually allow them to take their own place within the same world their parents currently occupy. A world where the relevant currency is not wages earned but reputation maintained, alliances cultivated, and a particular kind of effortless seeming competence performed so smoothly that the years of training behind it become ideally invisible. And yet here too, I want to resist the easy version of this story, the one where the wealthy children simply have it better in every conceivable way, and the poor children simply have it worse. Edmund, at 10, sees his mother for roughly an hour a day, and his father considerably less than that, raised primarily by a governess he likes well enough but does not love the way he might love a parent, in a large, beautiful house that can feel, by his own quiet admission to Miss Carrow on more than one occasion, a little lonely in its size, its many rooms mostly empty of the kind of constant noisy presence that fills an apartment like Sadie's from 5 in the morning until well past dark. Beatrice has a bedroom larger than Esther's entire family's living space, filled with toys that would represent, to a family like the one on Hester Street, several months of total household income, and she has, by her own 7-year-old reckoning, exactly one friend her own age that she sees with any real regularity, a cousin who lives several blocks away, and visits perhaps twice a month, because the social world a child like Beatrice moves in is curated as carefully and deliberately as her mother's morning calls, and casual, unsupervised friendship with whichever children happen to live nearby is simply not how this particular childhood is constructed. Esther, by contrast, knows every single child on her block, has a circle of friends she sees daily without any planning or supervision required at all, runs freely through streets that, whatever their genuine dangers and genuine hardships, offer a kind of constant social richness and casual companionship that Beatrice, in her quiet, beautiful, carefully managed nursery 3 miles north, simply does not have access to in anything like the same measure. I am not telling you this to suggest the two childhoods were somehow equal, because they plainly were not in safety, not in security, not in the raw material comfort of a warm room and a full stomach. I am telling you because history, when you actually look closely at it rather than from a comfortable distance, almost never hands you a clean story where one side has everything good and the other side has everything hard. It hands you this instead: 2 different kinds of difficulty, 2 different kinds of grace, existing 3 miles apart, on the same Monday, under the same grey February sky. Augusta's afternoon takes her out into the city itself, which is its own small production in this particular life, because a woman of her standing does not simply walk down the street unaccompanied the way Sadie walks freely to the pushcart market, with Dora on her hip. Augusta's carriage, with a coachman named Patrick who has driven for the family for nearly 6 years, waits at the front of the house at 1:30, and the short journey to her dressmaker's establishment on a side street off Fifth Avenue itself takes perhaps 15 minutes, conducted from inside a closed carriage that insulates her almost entirely from the actual texture and noise and smell of the street outside, glimpsed mostly through a small window as something closer to scenery than environment. The fitting itself is for a dinner gown intended for a ball later in the season, and it involves standing for the better part of an hour while 2 seamstresses pin and adjust fabric directly against her body, a process Augusta has done so many times across her adult life that she has learned to simply disengage her mind from the physical tedium of it, conducting small talk with the dressmaker about fabric and trim, while some other part of her attention drifts to the evening's dinner, to a note she still needs to write, to a small worry about whether her sister in Boston has been entirely truthful in her last letter about how she's actually feeling. That gown, when finished, will require something close to 20 yards of silk, hand beading along the bodice that will take a team of seamstresses working in shifts more than 60 hours to complete, and a final cost that, if Augusta ever bothered to add it up against Morris's annual wage at the pressing shop, would represent something in the neighborhood of 2 or 3 years of his entire income, spent on a single dress, worn perhaps 4 or 5 times before fashion moves on and a new gown becomes necessary for the following season. I don't say this to shame Augusta, who did not design the economic structure she was born into any more than Sadie designed hers, and who is, within the actual texture of her own daily life, a reasonably kind, reasonably thoughtful woman doing her genuine best within a role she inherited rather than chose. I say it because the number itself, sitting there quietly beside everything else we have discussed tonight, tells you something true about the scale of the gap between these two worlds that no amount of description quite captures as cleanly as a single concrete figure. After the fitting, there are 2 more calls to pay before the afternoon light begins to fail, brief visits to acquaintances whose good opinion matters for reasons that range from genuine friendship to careful social strategy. And Augusta returns home a little after 4, with perhaps 2 hours before she needs to begin dressing again, this time for the evening's dinner. Down on Hester Street, the afternoon has its own shape, quieter in some ways than the morning, but no less full. Sadie has been mending, mostly, sitting near the kitchen window for whatever light the airshaft still offers at this hour, working a needle through the knee of Hyman's trousers, worn through yet again from a winter of kneeling on cold pavement to arrange his bundle of newspapers each morning. There is a basket beside her chair that never seems to fully empty, stockings needing darning, a hem needing repair, Morris's shirt collar, frayed at the edge, needing to be turned and resewn so it can survive another few months of wear before it finally gives out entirely. Mending, in a household like this one, is not a leisure activity or a pleasant domestic hobby the way it sometimes gets romanticized in retrospect. It is economic necessity, performed because a new garment is simply not within reach, and a repaired one, however many times it has already been repaired, still has more useful life left in it than the cost of replacement would justify. Sadie is good at it, has gotten genuinely skilled over the years at making a repair nearly invisible, a small private craft she takes a quiet, rarely acknowledged pride in, even though almost no one outside this apartment will ever look closely enough to notice the work it represents. Dora naps for an hour in the early afternoon, the one reliable stretch of quiet in Sadie's entire day, and she uses it, as she uses every spare fragment of time, for more piecework, the sleeves piling up slowly beside her on the table, each one bringing her a fraction closer to the small payment due at the end of the week. By the time Esther returns from school a little after 3, the apartment has shifted into its late afternoon rhythm, Esther doing arithmetic at the table while her mother continues sewing, the two of them talking quietly between problems about Esther's teacher, about a girl in her class whose family is moving to Brooklyn, about nothing in particular, the small ordinary conversation that fills the space between larger tasks in any household, rich or poor, the genuine texture of a life rather than the highlight reel of it. Hyman comes home closer to 5, having sold his afternoon papers, handing his mother a small handful of coins that she counts without making a show of counting, tucking them into a tin box on a high shelf where the week's slowly accumulating rent money is kept, a box whose contents Sadie checks mentally almost every single day of her life, doing the same silent arithmetic over and over, rent due on the 1st, coal running low, Dora needing new shoes soon, the version of financial anxiety that exists not as an occasional worry, but as something closer to constant low background noise, present in nearly every waking hour whether she is actively thinking about it or not. The evening meal tonight is simple: potato and onion, a small piece of meat from this morning's shopping stretched as far as it will reasonably go, bread from yesterday, and tea. It is not an elegant meal by any measure, but it is hot, and there is enough of it, and the family eats together at the small table in the front room. Morris arriving home just as Sadie sets the last dish down, his hands still smelling faintly of the hot iron he has been pressing against fabric for 11 straight hours. And there is in this particular ordinary moment something genuinely warm happening that I don't want you to miss, simply because the apartment is cold and cramped and the meal is modest. 5 people together, at the end of a hard day, talking over each other a little. Dora banging a spoon against the table for no reason anyone can identify. Hyman recounting some small drama from his corner that happened that afternoon involving another newsboy and a dispute over territory. Esther correcting some small detail of his story with the confident superiority of a younger sibling who has heard the story told slightly differently twice already. This is not deprivation in every single moment of its existence. It is also, simultaneously and without contradiction, a family. By 7 in the evening, the Lathrop house has transformed into something closer to a small theatrical production than a private home. The dinner tonight is not the major 16-guest affair planned for later in the week, but it is still a proper dinner, 8 guests total, and the preparation for it has been underway, in one form or another, since shortly after lunch. Augusta dresses again. A third change of clothing for the day if you count the morning's walking dress and the lighter afternoon gown worn for her calls, this time into something more formal, deep claret-coloured silk, with Bridget once again managing the long row of hooks and the careful arrangement of her hair, adding, this time, a small diamond pin that belonged to Charles's mother and gets worn, by quiet family tradition, at every dinner of any real consequence. Downstairs, the dining room has been laid since 5, the table extended with additional leaves to accommodate 8 comfortably, set with china brought out specifically for occasions like this one, and never used for the family's ordinary private meals, silver polished that afternoon by a footman whose entire job for a 2-hour stretch consisted of nothing but polishing, candles placed at intervals calculated as much for their visual effect against the white tablecloth as for any actual lighting need, since the room is also lit by gas sconces along the walls. The meal itself runs to 7 courses, beginning with a clear consommé, followed by a fish course, a small palate-clearing sorbet course between the fish and the meat. The meat course itself, typically a roast of some kind, accompanied by 2 or 3 vegetable preparations arranged with real visual intention, a salad course, and finally dessert, often something elaborate, a moulded cream or a delicate pastry that has taken Mrs. Hennessy and her kitchen staff the better part of the entire afternoon to assemble correctly. Every single course is served in a precise and unvarying sequence by Mr. Pratt, the butler, and Thomas, the footman, moving around the table with a coordinated quietness that took both of them years to fully develop, removing plates from the left, serving from the right, refilling wine glasses without ever once being asked, anticipating exactly when a guest has finished a course before that guest has necessarily finished, consciously thinking about being finished. This kind of service is its own genuine skill, invisible by design, successful specifically to the degree that no guest at the table ever has to think about it at all. Conversation at the table moves through business lightly, since direct business talk is considered somewhat indelicate at a dinner like this one. Through a recent opera performance several of the guests attended, through a piece of social gossip concerning a mutual acquaintance daughter's engagement, conducted with the kind of practiced lightness that makes genuinely sharp judgment sound like nothing more than pleasant chat. Augusta steers the conversation when it needs steering, draws out a quieter guest who seems to be struggling to find an opening, redirects smoothly away from a topic that threatens to turn slightly tense between 2 of the men present, all of it done so seamlessly that an outside observer might not register that any steering was happening at all, which is again rather the entire point of the skill. After dinner, the men remain at the table for a period with cigars and a final glass of something stronger, while the women withdraw to the drawing room for coffee. A separation of the sexes after dinner that was at this point in the era still nearly universal among households of this class, inherited from English tradition and followed without much active thought, simply the way an evening like this one is structured. By 10:30, the guests have gone, Carriages called for them by Thomas standing at the front door in the cold, and the family retires upstairs. Augusta finally, genuinely tired in a way that has less to do with physical exertion than with the sustained hour-upon-hour effort of performing exactly the right degree of warmth and wit and gracious attention required by an evening like this one. But the house itself is not finished for the night, not nearly. Below stairs, the work continues for hours after the family has gone up. Mrs. Hennessy and the kitchen staff are scrubbing pots that have held 7 separate courses for 8 people, an enormous quantity of cookware and serving dishes that will not be fully clean and put away until well past midnight. The silver gets carefully wrapped and returned to its case. The dining room itself gets cleared completely, crumbs swept, the table leaves removed and stored. The whole elaborate stage set dismantled so thoroughly that by morning there will be no visible trace at all of the production that occupied this room just hours before. Bridget waits up for Augusta, of course, helping her out of the claret silk and the corset and the carefully arranged hair, a process that takes nearly as long undone as it took to assemble in the first place, and it is close to midnight before Bridget herself finally climbs the narrow servants' staircase to her own small room on the 4th floor, where she will sleep for perhaps 5 hours before the entire cycle begins again at 5:30 the next morning. I want to point something out here gently because I think it is easy to look at an evening like this one and see only the glittering surface of it, the silk and the silver and the 7 courses, and miss the fact that an evening like this one runs, quite literally, on the compressed and largely unpaid attention of a small army of people whose own exhaustion at the end of it is every bit as real as anything Sadie feels at the end of her own much harder, much more physically punishing day. The difference is not that one household works and the other does not. The difference is where the work is located, who performs it, and how completely it has been arranged to disappear from the consciousness of the people it serves. Back on Hester Street, the evening winds down in a completely different register, quieter in volume, though not necessarily in the busyness underneath it. After the meal, Sadie clears the table, washing the few dishes in water left over from earlier in the day, while Morris sits near the stove with the evening paper, reading slowly, sounding out occasional unfamiliar English words under his breath, a habit Sadie finds quietly endearing even after 4 years of marriage. This grown man, exhausted from 11 hours of pressing hot iron against fabric, still patiently working through a language that did not come naturally to either of them. Esther finishes her arithmetic at the table by the light of the kerosene lamp, its flame small and a little unsteady, throwing long shadows up the walls that make the cramped front room feel, for a moment, larger than it actually is. The way lamplight always seems to soften the edges of a small space into something gentler than daylight reveals it to be. Hyman, who finished school and selling papers hours ago, has been given the rare luxury of a few minutes to himself before bed, and spends them, as he often does, looking at a battered illustrated magazine a friend lent him. Something about adventures in the American West that feels, to a boy who has never left this neighborhood, almost as distant and exotic as the moon. Bedtime in an apartment this size is its own quiet negotiation. Hyman and Esther share the windowless middle room, in a bed pushed against one wall, and there is a particular skill, one that children in households like this one develop without anyone ever formally teaching it to them, in falling asleep quickly despite the noise carrying through thin walls from the apartment next door, despite the cold that settles into that windowless room once the stove's heat fails to fully reach it, despite the simple lack of any real privacy at all. Dora sleeps, as she always does, in the bed with Sadie and Morris, curled against her mother's side the way she was when this entire day began 14 hours ago. Before sleep, Sadie does one more thing, a small private ritual that she performs most nights and rarely mentions to anyone, standing for just a moment at the one window in the front room, looking down at Hester Street below, still busy even at this hour with the last pushcart vendors wheeling their carts away, a few men walking home from late shifts, the gas lamps along the street throwing their familiar orange pools onto wet pavement. She thinks, on nights like this one, about the small town outside Minsk she almost never speaks of, about whether this was the right decision, about whether 400 square feet and a coal stove that fights her every single morning, and a husband's hands growing prematurely old from a 15-pound iron is, in fact, a better life than the one she left behind. She generally decides that it is, though the certainty of that conclusion varies somewhat depending on the day, depending on how cold the apartment is, depending on how much money remains in the tin box on the high shelf. Tonight, looking down at the street, at this neighborhood full of people who left similar towns for similar reasons and are in their own apartments up and down this block, having some version of this exact same quiet evening, she decides that it is. She climbs into bed beside Dora's small warm shape, and within minutes, exhausted in the particular bone-deep way that a day like this one produces, she is asleep 3 miles north. The city at this hour looks, in certain narrow respects, almost the same from both apartments and the mansion's third-floor windows. The same gas lamps mostly line both streets, though Fifth Avenues are kept slightly brighter, slightly more consistently maintained by a city government that has, even now, not entirely equalized its attention across every neighborhood it serves. The same February cold presses against both sets of windows, the same scattering of light snow that began falling sometime after dark, continuing to drift down past both buildings, with the same quiet indifference to which side of the city it happens to be landing on. Somewhere between these two worlds, geographically and otherwise, the ordinary machinery of the city continues running through the night, regardless of who is sleeping and who is still awake. Milk wagons are already being loaded at a handful of depots scattered across Manhattan, horses being harnessed for routes that will begin well before dawn, delivering bottles to doorsteps on Fifth Avenue and to grocers on Hester Street with more or less equal reliability, because milk, unlike almost everything else in this story, moves through the city along genuinely shared infrastructure that does not much care about the relative wealth of whoever happens to be drinking it. Ice wagons, too, idle for now in stables near the river, will be moving again within hours, hauling blocks cut from frozen lakes upstate the previous winter and stored in enormous insulated warehouses through the summer, sold to households across the entire economic spectrum of the city, though in radically different quantities, a single small block purchased reluctantly and stretched as far as possible in a tenement kitchen, an entire steady, unremarked-upon supply maintained continuously in the cellar of a Fifth Avenue mansion. There is a kind of comfort, I think, in noticing these threads that run underneath the obvious differences, the milk and the ice and the snow and the gas lamps, the small handful of things that genuinely did connect every household in this city regardless of which side of it they happened to occupy. It does not erase the gap between Hester Street and Fifth Avenue. Nothing could and nothing should pretend to, but it is worth remembering, especially at this hour, with both neighborhoods finally quiet and both families finally asleep, that the city holding all of them was in the end one city, however unevenly it chose to arrange its own comforts among the people living inside it. I want to slow down here for a moment and talk about something that touched both of these households, though it touched them in profoundly unequal ways, and that is health. Because if there is one area where the gap between Hester Street and Fifth Avenue becomes almost impossible to discuss gently, it is this one, and I think it deserves honest attention rather than a quick pass over. In the year 1900, a child born on the Lower East Side faced odds that would be genuinely shocking to a modern parent. Infant mortality in the most crowded immigrant districts of Manhattan ran high enough that losing a child in the first year of life, while never something any family treated lightly, was common enough that it touched nearly every extended family on a block like Sadie's at some point or another. The causes were rarely mysterious: contaminated milk before pasteurization became standard, diarrheal illness spreading easily through shared water sources and inadequate sanitation, tuberculosis, which people of the period generally called consumption, spreading with particular ease through buildings where air shafts barely qualified as ventilation, and where 5 or 6 or 7 people regularly slept in a single small room. Sadie herself lost a child before Dora was born, a boy, between Esther and Dora in age, who lived just under a year before a respiratory illness took him during a particularly hard winter. She does not speak of him often, and when she does, it is briefly, a name mentioned and then set gently aside, the way grief sometimes has to be handled in a life that genuinely does not have the luxury of dwelling. This is not a detail I include lightly, and I am not going to dwell on it further than this single moment, because that loss is not the story of this household. It is simply a true part of it, one thread among many, and I think honouring it means naming it honestly and then letting it rest, the way Sadie herself has had to learn to let it rest. When illness does strike in this neighbourhood, medical care looks considerably different than what Augusta would ever experience. There are dispensaries, charitable clinics offering free or nearly free treatment, often staffed by young doctors building their early careers and sometimes overwhelmed by the sheer volume of patients arriving on any given day. There are local doctors who will visit a tenement apartment for a modest fee, though calling one out is not a decision made lightly given the cost. And there is, running underneath all of it, the constant informal medical knowledge passed between women in the building, remedies and home treatments, and the accumulated folk wisdom of dozens of households who have, between them, seen nearly every common illness pass through their children at one point or another. 3 miles north, illness is handled in an entirely different register. The Lathrop family has a private physician, Dr. Aldridge, who has attended this household for over a decade and knows the medical history of every single member of the family in detail, who comes to the house at the first sign of even a minor complaint rather than the family going to him, and whose fee for a single visit would represent, without exaggeration, more money than Sadie's family spends on food in an entire week. When Beatrice had a bout of scarlet fever 2 years ago, a disease that in a tenement household could easily have proven fatal given crowded conditions and limited care, Dr. Aldridge visited daily for nearly 2 weeks. A trained nurse was brought in to live at the house around the clock for the duration of the illness, and Beatrice recovered fully, in a private bedroom kept carefully warm and quiet, attended constantly with resources deployed toward her recovery that simply did not exist as an option for most children in this city, regardless of how much any individual immigrant mother might have wished otherwise for her own child. This is, I think, one of the genuinely hardest truths sitting underneath tonight's story, and I don't want to soften it into something more comfortable than it actually was. Wealth in the year 1900 quite literally bought survival in ways that went far beyond comfort or convenience. It bought a meaningfully higher chance that your child would live to see adulthood. That is not a small thing to sit with, and it is not something either family particularly chose in any direct sense, though it shaped both of their lives with an unequal weight that neither one fully escapes. And yet even here, I think there is something worth noticing that complicates the picture slightly, because medicine in this period was still, by later standards, remarkably limited regardless of how much money stood behind it. There were no antibiotics anywhere in the world in 1900, not for the wealthiest family in New York and not for the poorest. Dr. Aldridge, for all his fine training and his immediate availability, could not actually cure pneumonia any more effectively than the dispensary doctor on the Lower East Side could. Not in any fundamental sense, because the actual medical tools to cure it simply did not exist yet for anyone on either side of this story, regardless of income. What money bought, overwhelmingly, was not better medicine in the way we would understand that today. It bought better conditions, cleaner air, more space between bodies, better nutrition to support a weakened immune system, faster response time before an illness had a chance to progress. The advantage was real, and it was significant, and it was in the end more about circumstance than about medical science actually being different between these two worlds, which is itself a strange kind of comfort and a strange kind of tragedy, both true at once. Let me tell you about Friday on Hester Street, because if Monday is the hardest day of Sadie's week, Friday is in its own quiet way the most beautiful one, and I think it deserves real attention rather than getting lost in the catalogue of hardship we have been building tonight. Preparation for the Sabbath begins early in the week and intensifies as Friday approaches. Sadie has been saving in small increments for a slightly better cut of meat than the family eats on ordinary days, and on Thursday afternoon she makes a special trip to the butcher specifically for it, along with a few other small indulgences that the household budget cannot support every single day but can, through careful management, support once a week. Flour for challah, the braided egg bread that is for many families in this neighborhood the single most anticipated food of the entire week, gets set aside on Thursday evening, and Sadie rises even earlier than usual on Friday morning to begin the dough, working it by hand on the same kitchen table where she finishes piecework sleeves on every other day of the week, kneading and folding with a rhythm that has become, over the years, almost meditative, one of the few tasks in her week that she would honestly describe, if anyone asked, as something closer to pleasure than obligation. The braiding itself, 3 strands twisted into the traditional pattern, is a small ritual she is gradually teaching to Esther, who is old enough now to help shape the smaller of the 2 loaves, her 9-year-old hands working the dough with an exaggerated seriousness that makes Sadie smile every single time, a private joke between them that neither one has ever quite put into words. By Friday afternoon, the entire apartment has begun to smell different than it does on any other day of the week, the challah baking filling the rooms with something warm and sweet that briefly overpowers even the lingering smell of coal smoke and last week's laundry, and there is a kind of anticipatory lightness in the household that builds steadily through the afternoon. Sadie cleans more thoroughly than usual, not because anyone is coming to inspect the apartment, but because there is something in the act of preparing carefully for the Sabbath that matters to her in a way that goes beyond simple housekeeping, a small weekly assertion that this family, however cramped their rooms and however thin their margins, still observes, still honors, still maintains a tradition stretching back further than either she or Morris can fully trace. As the sun sets, Sadie lights the Sabbath candles, 2 of them, in brass candlesticks that were her mother's and that made the entire journey from outside Minsk, wrapped carefully in a shawl inside her single trunk, one of perhaps a dozen physical objects she brought with her from that entire previous life. She covers her eyes and says the blessing quietly, and there is a stillness in this exact moment, every single Friday, that stands in genuine contrast to nearly every other hour of her week. The children gather. Morris, home a little earlier on Fridays by arrangement with his employer, who is himself observant and closes the shop before sundown, washes and changes into a clean shirt, one of the very few moments in his week when he is not, in some fashion, working. The meal that follows is, by the standards of this household's ordinary week, genuinely abundant. The better cut of meat prepared with real care, the challah still faintly warm. A sweet dish, something with raisins or dried fruit if the budget has allowed for it that particular week. Wine, a small amount. Enough for the blessing and a taste for everyone at the table, including, in recent years, a few careful drops touched to Dora's lips. The family eats slowly, without the rushed quality of weekday meals, and there is singing afterward, traditional table songs that Morris leads in a voice that Sadie has always privately thought is better than he gives himself credit for, Hyman and Esther joining in on the parts they know, Dora clapping along to a rhythm only loosely connected to the actual song. For one evening out of every 7, this apartment, 400 square feet, cold in winter, lit by kerosene and the warm flicker of those 2 brass candlesticks, becomes something that feels to everyone inside it genuinely complete. I want you to hold on to that image for a moment, because I think it matters enormously to the larger shape of tonight's story. Hardship was real in this household, constant and exhausting and never fully escaped, but it did not consume every single hour of every single day, and it certainly did not consume Friday evening, which remained, week after week, a small fixed point of warmth and dignity and continuity that no landlord, no contractor shorting a piecework payment, no cold morning fight with a stubborn coal stove could fully touch. 3 miles north, the Lathrop household is approaching its own version of a culminating weekly event, though it arrives on a different night and wears an entirely different shape. The major dinner Augusta has been preparing for all week, the 16-guest affair that required the grey wool dress decision and the dressmaker fitting and the careful correspondence to be set in motion days in advance, finally arrives on Thursday evening, and it represents in its own way the same kind of culminating weekly effort that Friday represents for Sadie, just translated into an entirely different register of meaning and consequence. The preparation for this particular evening has consumed a significant portion of the household's collective attention for the better part of a week. Mrs. Hennessy has been planning the menu since Sunday. The French chef arrives Thursday morning and effectively takes over the kitchen for the day, working alongside Mrs. Hennessy in an arrangement that requires real diplomatic skill from both women, since neither one particularly enjoys deferring to the other, but both understand that an evening of this scale genuinely requires the additional hands and specialized skill the chef brings. Extra footmen are hired for the evening itself, the household's permanent staff simply not being numerous enough to properly serve 16 guests across the full sequence of courses planned. Augusta wears the claret silk again for this one, having decided the new ball gown, still not entirely finished, should be saved for its intended occasion later in the season, rather than debuted at a dinner, however significant. The guest list has been assembled with enormous care over the preceding weeks, balancing business relationships that matter to Charles against social friendships that matter to Augusta, against the simple practical question of which combinations of personalities tend to produce a genuinely pleasant evening rather than an awkward one, an entire invisible art that Augusta has spent 15 years of married life slowly mastering. The evening itself unfolds much as the smaller dinner did earlier this week, just amplified considerably in scale and consequence. 7 courses stretched to 9 for an occasion of this importance, conversation steered with even more careful attention given the number of competing interests gathered at a single table, and by the time the last carriage pulls away well after midnight, both Augusta and the household staff are operating on something close to fumes, the entire week's worth of careful preparation finally spent in a single long evening that will be discussed, evaluated, and quietly judged by every single guest who attended it, in conversations Augusta will never directly hear but will absolutely eventually feel the consequences of, one way or another, in the weeks that follow. I want to step back from this particular week for a moment and widen the lens slightly, because the contrast between these two households becomes, if anything, even sharper once you follow them through the full turn of a year, and summer in New York City at the turn of the century is where that contrast reaches something close to its most extreme. New York summers in this period were genuinely brutal, made considerably worse in tenement neighborhoods by the sheer density of bodies and buildings packed into a small area, brick and stone and pavement holding heat through the night in a way that modern researchers would later come to understand and name, though nobody on Hester Street in 1900 had a word for it beyond simply unbearable. There was no electric fan running in Sadie's apartment, no relief of any kind once the sun went down except whatever faint movement of air the one window onto the air shaft might offer, which on the worst nights was nothing at all. Families in this situation developed their own informal solutions, born of necessity rather than choice. Rooftops across the entire Lower East Side became, on the hottest nights of summer, something close to communal bedrooms, mattresses and blankets hauled up 5 or 6 flights by people desperate enough for relief that the climb felt worth it. Dozens of families from a single block all sleeping under the open sky within feet of each other, a strange, sweaty, oddly companionable summer ritual that children of the period would remember, decades later, with a fondness that surprised even themselves, because a shared rooftop full of neighbors under the stars, however born of hardship, created its own kind of community that a more comfortable life might never have produced. Heat-related illness and death spiked predictably and tragically every summer in neighborhoods like this one, infants and the elderly suffering the most, and city officials and reformers spent considerable energy in these years trying to address it, opening public bathing facilities, pushing for small playground spaces carved out of impossibly dense blocks, distributing ice to the poor through charitable efforts during the worst heat waves, efforts that helped at the margins without ever fundamentally solving the underlying density problem that made the heat so dangerous in the first place. The Lathrop family, like nearly every household of their standing, simply leaves the city entirely for the worst of it. By late June, the house on Fifth Avenue is largely closed up, furniture covered in protective sheeting, most of the staff given a reduced schedule or sent along to the family's summer property on the Long Island shore. A rambling shingled house considerably less grand than the city residence, but blessed with something the city house can never offer in August: genuine ocean breeze and open green space in every direction. Augusta and the children spend nearly the entire summer there, Charles joining them on weekends and for a longer stretch in August when business in the city slows along with the heat, and the rhythm of life shifts considerably, less rigid in its social calendar, more centered around the simple physical pleasures of swimming and sailing and long afternoons on a wide porch that catches whatever breeze happens to be moving off the water. It is by any measure a genuinely pleasant existence, and Augusta has sometimes wondered, in idle private moments she would never voice aloud, what it might be like to live this way year-round, rather than returning each autumn to the more demanding rhythm of the city season, though she has never seriously entertained the thought as anything more than a passing daydream, because the city season, however exhausting, is also where the actual substance of her social position gets maintained and renewed each year. There is no equivalent escape available to Sadie's family, obviously, and I don't want to dwell on that gap longer than it deserves, because by this point in tonight's story I think you understand the shape of it well enough without my needing to underline it further. What I find more interesting, honestly, is a detail that sits quietly underneath this entire seasonal divide, which is that the very same newspapers Morris reads slowly by the kitchen stove each evening, the same papers Hyman sells on his corner each morning, were by this point in the city's history beginning to actively cover the conditions on the Lower East Side with a seriousness and visual detail that earlier decades had never offered. A journalist and photographer working in this exact period had, just a few years earlier, published an extensively illustrated account of tenement conditions that shocked a meaningful portion of the city's wealthier readers, many of whom had genuinely never seen, in any concrete visual way, what a building like Sadie's actually looked like from the inside. That work, and the broader reform movement gathering momentum alongside it, would help push through a major piece of tenement housing legislation within the next year or two of the period we are exploring tonight, legislation that would gradually and imperfectly begin requiring better ventilation, more adequate plumbing, and improved fire safety in new tenement construction going forward, even though it would do comparatively little in the near term for families already living in older buildings like Sadie's. Change, when it eventually came to neighborhoods like this one, came slowly, unevenly, and almost never quickly enough for the families actually living through the conditions that prompted it. But it did come, eventually, built in no small part on exactly the kind of unglamorous, repetitive, daily documentation of ordinary domestic struggle that we have spent tonight trying, in our own much smaller and much later way, to honor. Let's talk for a moment about simply getting around this city, because how a person moved through New York in 1900 says almost as much about their place within it as anything we have discussed so far. For Sadie, getting anywhere of consequence means walking, nearly always, and her entire world, in practical terms, is bounded by how far her own two legs can comfortably carry her, while also managing a toddler on one hip and a basket of shopping on the other arm. The pushcart market, the butcher, the bakery, Hester's school, the settlement house, Morris's shop, all of it sits within a radius of perhaps 6 or 8 blocks, and Sadie rarely has occasion or spare money to travel meaningfully beyond that radius in an ordinary week. When a longer trip becomes genuinely necessary, there are horse cars running along the wider avenues, and increasingly elevated steam trains rattling along iron tracks suspended above several of the major thoroughfares, an entire elevated railway network that by this point carries an enormous volume of the city's daily foot traffic up into the air, shaking dust and occasional hot ash down onto the street below, loud enough that conversation directly underneath the tracks becomes briefly impossible every few minutes as a train passes overhead. The fare for either the horse car or the elevated runs a few cents, not an enormous sum in absolute terms, but enough that Sadie thinks carefully before spending it, generally reserving it for trips that walking simply cannot reasonably accomplish. A visit to a relative in a more distant part of the city perhaps, or, on the rare festive occasion, an outing to one of the larger parks. There is also, just beginning to take real shape beneath the city's streets at this exact moment in history, an entirely new kind of transportation that neither Sadie nor Augusta has yet experienced because it does not exist yet, not quite. Construction crews are, even as this particular week unfolds, working on tunnels that will eventually become the city's first subway line, an enormous engineering undertaking that will not open to the public for another 4 years, but whose construction is already in 1902 visible as torn-up streets and construction barriers in various parts of lower and midtown Manhattan, a small present-tense reminder that the city both of these families inhabit is itself mid-transformation, becoming something neither woman can fully picture yet, though both of them, along with the children who will inherit this future city more directly than either parent, will eventually ride those very trains as an unremarkable part of daily life. Augusta, for her part, almost never walks for transportation in any meaningful sense, beyond the short, leisurely strolls considered appropriate and even fashionable for exercise on a pleasant afternoon. Her carriage, with Patrick driving, handles essentially every journey of consequence, and her actual physical experience of the city's streets is consequently far more limited and far more curated than Sadie's, glimpsed through a carriage window as a kind of moving backdrop rather than walked directly on foot. She has been on an elevated train exactly twice in her adult life, both times as something close to a novelty excursion, arranged by a friend who found the experience amusingly adventurous, and she found it on both occasions considerably louder and considerably less comfortable than she expected, an experience she discussed afterward with the kind of mild, faintly performed astonishment that women of her set sometimes affected when describing brief, deliberate excursions into how the rest of the city actually lived and moved. This matters, I think, beyond simple convenience, because it shapes how completely each woman's mental map of the city differs from the others. Sadie knows her own neighborhood with an intimacy that comes from walking every single one of its streets repeatedly, week after week, year after year, knows which butcher's prices creep up on a Thursday, and which back alley shortcut shaves 2 minutes off the walk to the settlement house. Augusta knows the city primarily as a network of addresses connected by carriage routes, the specific physical texture of the blocks in between, largely invisible to her, present only as time elapsed and scenery passed, rather than as ground actually walked. Let me say a little more, before we move further into the evening, about the men's working worlds, because we have spent a great deal of tonight inside these two households and inside the experience of these two women specifically, and I think both Morris and Charles deserve a slightly fuller picture before we let the night settle in fully around all 4 of them. Morris's pressing shop is one of perhaps a dozen similar small operations within a few blocks of Hester Street, a single room on the 2nd floor of a commercial building, hot year-round from the gas-heated irons running constantly along a row of tables, 12 men working in close quarters for the 11-hour shifts that define this particular trade. The work is repetitive almost to the point of numbness. Lift the iron, press, lift, press, garment after garment after garment, hundreds of them across a single day, and it is also in its own way genuinely skilled, requiring a feel for exactly how much heat and pressure a particular fabric can withstand without scorching or stretching it out of shape. A skill Morris has built up over nearly 6 years in this trade since arriving in the country. The shop owner, a man named Feldman who emigrated himself a decade earlier and built this small operation up from nothing, is not unkind exactly, but he runs the floor with the constant underlying pressure of a business operating on margins thin enough that a slow week genuinely threatens every single job in the room, Morris's included. There is no formal arrangement protecting these workers in any meaningful sense. No guaranteed hours, no real recourse if Feldman decides in a slow stretch to simply reduce the staff for a few weeks until orders pick back up, and this precariousness sits underneath Morris's entire working life as a kind of constant low pressure that never fully lifts, not unlike the financial anxiety running underneath nearly every hour of Sadie's own day. Charles Lathrop's working world, 3 miles south in a different sense now, down in the financial district rather than simply north on Fifth Avenue, could not look more different on its surface. Conducted from a comfortable office with his name on the door, surrounded by clerks and junior partners rather than fellow labourers at adjacent pressing tables. And yet I think it's only fair to say, gently, that Charles too operates under a version of constant pressure, different in scale and texture but not entirely absent, the pressure of maintaining relationships with clients whose business could shift to a competitor at any point, the pressure of a financial market in this particular period that remains genuinely volatile, prone to the kind of sudden panics and contractions that periodically swept through American banking in these decades, capable of erasing a fortune, or at minimum severely denting one, in the span of a few catastrophic weeks. Charles has weathered 2 such episodes already in his career, and carries, underneath his own composed exterior, a private awareness that the gulf separating his household from genuine financial distress, while enormously wider than the gulf separating Morris's household from the same fate, is not in fact infinite. I think it's worth pulling the lens back even further for a moment, because Hester Street itself, however central it has been to tonight's story, was only one thread in an extraordinarily dense and varied neighbourhood, and the Lower East Side in 1900 was not a single uniform world, any more than the city as a whole was. Walk a few blocks in one direction from Sadie's building, and the language on the signs shifts from Yiddish to Italian, an entire separate immigrant world, layered into the same crowded grid of streets, its own pushcart market selling different vegetables, different cuts of meat, its own churches rather than synagogues, its own networks of mutual aid societies that functioned, in their own communities, much the way Sadie's own informal network of building neighbours functioned for her, a web of small favours and shared information that helped families survive margins too thin to survive entirely alone. Walk a few blocks in a different direction and you would find yourself in a smaller, tighter cluster of streets, where the signs shifted again, this time into Chinese characters, a community considerably smaller in this period than it would later become, shaped by restrictive federal immigration law that had for nearly 2 decades already sharply limited new arrivals from China in a way that did not apply to European immigration, creating a neighbourhood demographically skewed, at this point in its history, overwhelmingly toward men who had come seeking work and were in many cases unable under existing law to bring wives or families to join them, a quieter, lonelier kind of immigrant hardship running alongside the crowded family tenement life of streets like Sadie's, and further south and west, an Irish immigrant presence considerably older than either the Jewish or Italian communities, having arrived in the city in enormous numbers decades earlier, by this point somewhat more established, with a meaningful foothold in city politics and municipal employment, the police force and the fire department in particular, that the more recently arrived Jewish and Italian families had not yet achieved in anything like the same numbers, though that too would shift considerably within another generation or two. This matters, I think, because it would be a mistake to imagine the gap between Hester Street and Fifth Avenue as the only meaningful divide running through this story. There were divides within Hester Street's own neighbourhood too, divides of language and religion and how long a family had been in the country, and how precarious or relatively stable their specific situation happened to be. An entire intricate map of overlapping hardship and mutual unfamiliarity that does not reduce neatly into a single clean comparison, however useful that comparison has been for tonight's purposes. Clothing tells a small but vivid version of this same broader story, and I want to spend a moment on the actual physical feel of it, because that sensory detail says something that statistics alone cannot. The fabric of Morris's everyday shirt is coarse cotton, worn thin in places from repeated washing, mended at the collar more than once by Sadie's careful hand, and it smells even fresh from the wash, faintly of the lye soap used to clean it, and faintly, underneath that, of the coal smoke that permeates the entire building regardless of how thoroughly any single garment gets scrubbed. Hester's school dress is a simple cotton print, handed down from an older girl in the building whose family outgrew it, taken in slightly at the waist by Sadie to fit, worn proudly nonetheless because it is, by the standards of most of her classmates, a perfectly respectable garment. Augusta's claret silk, by contrast, has a weight and a coolness against the skin entirely unlike anything in Sadie's wardrobe, a fabric so finely woven that it catches light in a way coarse cotton simply cannot, and it carries its own scent too, faint traces of the lavender sachets kept in her wardrobe specifically to keep stored garments smelling fresh, layered underneath the lighter floral scent of perfume applied that evening. Beatrice's everyday dresses, made of fine lawn cotton and trimmed with lace that a seamstress applied by hand, are replaced for a new size every few months as she grows. The outgrown garments not handed down within the family in the way Esther's dress was handed down, but rather given away to charity or, in some cases, simply discarded. A casualness about the actual material value of clothing that would strike Sadie, if she ever witnessed it directly, as something close to a foreign concept entirely. Sundays bring their own kind of rest to the Lathrop household. In keeping with the broadly Protestant Christian observance most of New York's wealthy families followed at this point, the family attending services at a fashionable church not far from the house, dressed formally, seen and greeting other families from the same social circle in the same unhurried, socially attentive way that defines nearly every public appearance in Augusta's life, before returning home to a quieter Sunday afternoon. No calls paid or received on this particular day by long tradition, a genuine if narrow window of rest before the working week's social calendar resumes on Monday. For entertainment beyond the rhythms of church and calling cards, Augusta and Charles attend the opera with some regularity, a box at one of the city's grand opera houses, representing both genuine musical pleasure and an unmistakable, carefully understood display of status, since who occupies which box and who can be seen visiting whom between acts carries social weight nearly equal to the music itself. Theatre, too, the legitimate stage rather than anything more popular or down market, fills a number of their evenings across a typical season. Down on Hester Street, entertainment takes a different and in some ways considerably more accessible shape. Vaudeville houses dot the wider commercial streets just beyond the immediate tenement blocks, offering an evening's variety bill, singers and comedians and short novelty acts for an admission price low enough that even a family like Sadie's can manage it as an occasional treat, perhaps once every month or two, a genuine source of real joy and real laughter that costs a fraction of what a single evening at the opera costs the Lathrops, while delivering, by any honest measure, a comparably good time to the people actually sitting in the seats. There is something worth sitting with in that small fact too, I think. Joy in this city was not nearly as unevenly distributed as money was, even if the form it took, and the price tag attached to it, varied enormously from one world to the other. There is one more thread I want to pull on before we let this particular week settle fully into night, and it has to do with time itself, with what happens to a household like either one of these as the years move forward past this single snapshot we have been examining so closely tonight. Sadie does not spend much time thinking about old age. Not really. Not at 28 with a toddler on her hip and a tin box of rent money to manage, and a husband whose hands are already showing the wear of his trade. But the question sits there nonetheless, underneath everything, the way it sits underneath every working-class household in this period. There is no pension waiting for Morris at the end of his working years, no retirement savings beyond whatever small, irregular amount the family might manage to set aside, which in practice has so far amounted to almost nothing given how completely each week's income gets absorbed by that same week's needs. The expectation, largely unspoken but thoroughly understood, is that Hyman, and eventually whatever other children the family has, will be the ones who care for Sadie and Morris when the time comes that neither parent can work any longer, an arrangement that functioned across an enormous swath of working-class immigrant New York as the only real safety net available, fragile in the sense that it depended entirely on children growing up healthy, staying nearby, and being financially capable themselves of supporting an aging parent or two, but also in its own way, remarkably resilient, a form of mutual obligation passed down through generations, almost as a kind of unwritten family contract. For the Lathrops, old age carries an entirely different shape, secured by investments and property, and the kind of generational wealth that exists specifically to insulate a family from exactly the uncertainty that hangs over Sadie's future. Charles has already begun, in a quiet, methodical way typical of a man in his line of work, structuring his estate for eventual transfer to Edmund, with provisions for Beatrice as well. Conversations conducted with lawyers in formal offices rather than left to the informal, hopeful assumption of filial duty that governs Sadie's own old age planning, if you can even call something so thoroughly unplanned a plan at all. And yet I find myself thinking, the more time I spend with both of these families, that the actual emotional texture of growing old, whatever financial structure surrounds it, might end up looking more similar between these two worlds than either woman, standing here in 1902, could possibly imagine. Augusta will likely spend her later years navigating a different kind of uncertainty entirely, the uncertainty of whether Edmund and Beatrice, raised at a careful, managed emotional distance by governesses and nursemaids, will grow into adults who actually want her close presence in their own adult lives, or whether the formal, scheduled, hour-a-day model of parenting she inherited and replicated will leave her, in the end, somewhat more alone in old age than she expects right now, in this particular cold February week, to ever be. Sadie, meanwhile, raising Hyman and Esther and Dora in constant, unbroken, exhausting daily proximity, building a closeness with her children that simply has no equivalent in the Lathrop household structure, may well find herself, decades from now, surrounded by grandchildren in a way that Augusta, for all her wealth, never quite manages to be. I don't know that for certain, of course. Nobody standing in 1902 could know it for certain, and neither can we, looking back from wherever you happen to be tonight, more than a century removed from both of these lives. But it is worth holding, I think, as one more small complication in a story that has been, from its very first image of a dumbbell-shaped tenement and a Fifth Avenue closet, fundamentally a story about complication, about refusing the easy version where one life is simply harder and the other simply easier, all the way down to its very last detail. Snow continues falling outside both buildings now, the same light, steady snow that began earlier this evening, accumulating slowly along windowsills on Hester Street and along the wrought iron fence in front of the Lathrop house in equal measure, because snow, like the milk wagons and the ice and the cold itself, has never once in its long history shown the slightest interest in which side of a city's wealth divide it happens to be falling on. Let's stay with this night a little longer, because I think there is something genuinely worth lingering on in the particular quality of these hours after midnight, before the earliest deliveries begin, when the city comes about as close as it ever comes to true stillness. On Hester Street, the coal stove has gone cold again, the way it does every night, its iron surface slowly losing the last of the day's heat, the embers inside dimming from orange to a deep, dull red, and finally, sometime in these small hours, to nothing at all but grey ash waiting for Sadie's hands to clear it out again in a few hours' time. The apartment settles into the particular cold quiet of a tenement at night, audible in a way that daytime noise usually buries, the building's own structure creaking faintly as old wood contracts in the cold, a baby crying somewhere 2 floors below, and then, after a few minutes, settling, a man's footsteps on the stairs, returning late from some shift or some errand, climbing past Sadie's door without pausing, the whole building breathing around this one sleeping family the way it breathes around every family inside it, 150 separate lives layered on top of each other within the same brick walls, mostly invisible to one another and yet never entirely, truly alone either. Snow continues falling outside the one window, dusting the narrow ledge, catching faint light from the gas lamp on the street below and turning, for a moment if you happen to be watching closely enough, a pale soft gold before settling into the deeper blue-grey of the rest of the night. Sadie sleeps deeply, the particular dreamless, bone-deep sleep of a body that worked from 5 in the morning until well past dark. Dora curled warm against her side, Morris breathing slow and even beside her, his hands, even in sleep, slightly curled the way a hand grows accustomed to curling around the handle of a 15-pound iron held steady for 11 hours at a stretch. 3 miles north, the quiet wears a different texture, thicker somehow, more padded, the way wealth tends to pad nearly everything it touches, including silence itself. The Lathrop house at this hour is dark across nearly every window, the heavy curtains in each bedroom drawn fully closed against even the faint gaslight from the street. The radiators, fed by that same continuously tended coal boiler 3 floors below, ticking faintly now and then as the metal cools and contracts, the only sound in hallways carpeted thickly enough to swallow footsteps almost entirely. Augusta sleeps in a bed considerably larger than the one Sadie shares with her husband and youngest child, alone in it tonight, since Charles keeps a separate bedroom by the conventional arrangement of households at this social level, the 2 rooms connected by a shared dressing room, rather than by the simple, unavoidable physical closeness that defines Sadie's much smaller home. Down in the basement, the night fireman, whose job exists specifically and only to keep that boiler running steadily through every single hour of the night, so that the family upstairs never wakes to a cold house, sits awake near the great iron furnace, feeding it coal at intervals, dozing briefly between feedings in a hard wooden chair that has, over the years, worn a shape roughly matching his own body. He is in this exact moment perhaps the only person awake in this entire household, tending a fire that exists purely so that 7 other people, 6 of them family and 1 of them Bridget sleeping her own exhausted sleep 4 floors above him, never have to think about cold at all. I find something quietly moving in that image, if I am honest with you, this one man awake in a basement at 2 in the morning, alone with a furnace, so that an entire household 2 floors above him can sleep in warmth they will never once in the morning consciously credit to him. Out on the actual streets connecting these 2 worlds, the city itself continues its low, steady nighttime hum. A horse-drawn patrol wagon makes its way slowly along a route that touches both neighborhoods at different points in its circuit, a policeman walking his beat past darkened tenement doorways on one stretch of the night, and past the wrought iron fences of Fifth Avenue mansions on another, the same tired feet covering ground that, depending entirely on which block he happens to be standing on at any given moment, represents 2 almost incomparable versions of the same city. He has walked this beat for 9 years now, long enough to know most of the regular faces on both ends of his route, long enough to have formed his own quiet, rarely spoken opinions about the genuine difference and the genuine similarity running underneath both worlds, opinions he keeps mostly to himself, the way a man in his position generally learns to. Down by the East River, longshoremen are already beginning to stir for the earliest shifts, ships needing to be loaded and unloaded on schedules that do not particularly care what hour feels civilized. Ferries that will, within a few hours, begin carrying workers and goods back and forth across the water sit quiet at their docks for now, lit by a small number of lanterns waiting. Somewhere in the theatre district, considerably further uptown than either Hester Street or the Lathrop house, but still part of the same single sprawling city, the last patrons are filtering out of a late performance, carriages and the occasional automobile, still rare enough in 1902 to draw a few curious glances whenever one rattles past, gathering outside the theatre doors to carry them home through streets that are, by this hour, nearly as quiet as Hester Street and nearly as quiet as Fifth Avenue, all of it, finally, the entire enormous breathing organism of this city, settling toward whatever passes in a place this size for rest. Tomorrow, of course, both households will simply begin again. Sadie will wake before 5, the way she always does, and fight the same cold stove back to life with the same small ritual frustration, and haul the same 2 pails up the same 5 flights, and there will be a slightly different combination of tasks waiting, depending on the day of the week, but the underlying shape of her morning will repeat itself with a consistency that, if you stood far enough back from it, almost starts to look less like a single woman's individual days, and more like a single continuous rhythm, repeating itself across years, across an entire generation of women living almost exactly this same life, up and down this same crowded stretch of the Lower East Side. Augusta will wake at her own accustomed hour considerably later, and Bridget will already be moving quietly through the dressing room with warm water and a freshly pressed gown, and the leather notebook on the writing desk will already hold tomorrow's schedule, calls to make, calls to receive, some new small social negotiation requiring her careful attention, the specific details shifting from week to week even as the underlying structure of her days repeats itself with its own equally consistent rhythm, a different kind of repetition than Sadie's, built from performance and management rather than from raw physical labor, but a repetition nonetheless. I think this is in the end one of the truest things tonight's story can offer you. History, when you zoom in close enough, almost never looks like the single dramatic day that gets remembered in textbooks. It looks like exactly this: the same stove lit again tomorrow, the same calling cards left again next week, an entire life built not from singular dramatic moments, but from thousands of nearly identical mornings, stacked one on top of another until, without anyone quite noticing the precise moment it happened, an entire childhood has passed, an entire decade, an entire life. And if we let the lens pull back even further, past tomorrow, past this particular week, past even the remaining years of either woman's adult life, something else becomes visible too, something that neither Sadie nor Augusta could have possibly seen from where they each stood in 1902, caught up as they both were in the immediate, pressing reality of their own individual Tuesday. The neighborhood Sadie calls home will keep changing, the way it had already been changing for decades before she ever arrived in it. The Jewish immigrant community that fills Hester Street in this exact period will, across the coming decades, gradually move outward as families establish themselves more securely, toward Brooklyn, toward the Bronx, toward neighborhoods with more space and better light than a dumbbell tenement's airshaft could ever offer, and new waves of arrivals, from different parts of the world entirely, will move into these same buildings in their turn. The same narrow stairs climbed by different feet, the same kitchen windows fogged by different families' laundry steam, the particular cycle of immigrant New York repeating itself, generation after generation, on this same patch of ground, long after Sadie and Morris and their children have moved on to whatever comes next for them. The grand house on Fifth Avenue, for its part, will not stand forever either, not in its current form. A meaningful number of the mansions built along this stretch of the avenue in these very years will, within a few decades, be sold, demolished, replaced by the kind of tall apartment buildings and commercial structures that a changing city and changing tax structures, and a new generation no longer interested in maintaining single-family households of this almost absurd scale, will eventually make simply impractical to sustain. Some of these grand houses will be converted into something else entirely, a museum perhaps, or offices, their once private dining rooms open to the curious public. A handful will survive in something close to their original form, preserved precisely because they have become rare enough, by the time anyone thinks to preserve them, to feel worth the effort. Neither Sadie nor Augusta, standing in 1902, has any way of knowing any of this, of course. Each of them is simply living her own particular Tuesday, managing her own particular set of pressing concerns, a cold stove or a dinner party seating arrangement, with no sense at all that either one is a small moving piece inside a much larger story that historians a century later would still be trying to carefully reconstruct, detail by detail, household by household, in an effort to understand what an ordinary life in this extraordinary, unequal, endlessly fascinating city actually felt like from the inside. That, I think, is part of why I wanted to bring you here tonight, into both of these homes rather than just one. Not to deliver a simple lesson about inequality, though the inequality between these two households is real and worth sitting with honestly rather than smoothing over, but to give you something closer to the actual texture of an ordinary moment in history, the kind that rarely makes it into any single dramatic account, because nothing about either woman's Tuesday is dramatic in itself. It is just a life, lived one cold stove or one calling card at a time, and there is something I think genuinely worth honouring in that quiet, repetitive, almost invisible persistence on both sides of Fifth Avenue, on both sides of this entire, unequal, complicated, endlessly human city. I mentioned earlier that Sadie rarely speaks of the town outside Minsk she left behind, and that is true, but on certain nights, usually nights very much like this one, cold and quiet and snowing softly outside the one window, her mind drifts back there anyway, whether she invites it to or not, and I want to follow that drift with you for just a few minutes because I think it deepens everything we have looked at so far, rather than distracting from it. She was 24 when she left, travelling with Morris, who she had married only the year before. The two of them part of an enormous wave of Jewish emigration moving out of the Russian Empire in these particular years, driven by a combination of grinding poverty, legal restriction on where Jews were permitted to live and work, and the periodic, terrifying outbreaks of violence against Jewish communities that swept through the region with a regularity that made the decision to leave feel, to families like Sadie's, less like an adventurous choice and more like a simple, urgent question of survival. The journey itself began with a train to a port city, a journey that already felt, to a young woman who had rarely travelled more than a day's walk from her own town, disorientingly vast, and then a ship, steerage class, the cheapest possible passage, which meant Sadie and Morris spent the better part of 2 weeks crossing the Atlantic in a crowded lower deck compartment, packed with hundreds of other emigrants, bunks stacked 3 high, the air thick with seasickness and unwashed bodies, and a particular kind of close, anxious hope that Sadie still remembers with an intensity that surprises her sometimes, even now, years later. There was very little privacy of any kind. There was a single daily meal that varied wildly in quality depending on which crossing and which ship, and there was, running underneath the physical misery of the journey itself, a constant low hum of fear about what exactly awaited them on the other side. Fear she and Morris discussed openly with each other in low voices late at night, lying in adjacent narrow bunks, neither one fully able to picture what New York would actually look like, only that it had to be better than the place they were leaving. Arrival meant Ellis Island, a name that still carries a particular weight for Sadie even now. A long, exhausting day of medical inspection and document review conducted by officials speaking a language neither she nor Morris yet understood beyond a handful of memorized phrases, the genuine fear that some minor health issue or some bureaucratic irregularity might result in being sent back. A fear that turned out, for Sadie and Morris specifically, to be unfounded, though they had heard enough stories on the crossing itself of families separated at exactly this final gate to know the fear was not irrational. They were processed, eventually cleared, and released into a city that neither of them had any real preparation for, taken in initially by a distant cousin of Morris's who had arrived several years earlier and already had a small foothold on the Lower East Side, sleeping on that cousin's kitchen floor for the first several weeks, while Morris searched for work, and Sadie tried to make sense of a city that moved faster and louder and denser than anything either of them had previously imagined a place could be. I tell you this not to suggest that the hardship of Sadie's current life, the cold stove and the water hauling and the constant financial calculation, is somehow erased or made less real by the fact that it followed an even harder, more frightening period. It is simply part of the same continuous story, and I think it helps explain something about the particular durable resilience underneath everything we have watched Sadie do tonight. A woman who survived steerage and Ellis Island and those first uncertain weeks sleeping on a cousin's kitchen floor approaches a cold coal stove at 5 in the morning with a kind of hard-won, practiced steadiness that someone who had never faced anything harder might not have developed in quite the same way. The apartment on Hester Street, 400 square feet, no running water, an air shaft for a view, is not to Sadie the bottom of anything. It is, in the actual quiet arithmetic of her own life, considerably closer to the top of what she has known so far, and that perspective matters enormously to how she actually experiences the life we have spent tonight examining so closely. Augusta's own path to this particular Tuesday carries a very different shape, though it too involves its own kind of negotiated arrival. She was raised in a comfortable but not extraordinarily wealthy family in Philadelphia, her father a successful but solidly mid-tier attorney rather than anything approaching the financial scale of the Lathrop fortune she eventually married into, and her own girlhood, while considerably more comfortable than Sadie's, involved a real and carefully managed effort, on her mother's part especially, to position Augusta for exactly the kind of advantageous marriage that would eventually lift the family's social standing by a full generation in a single match. She met Charles at a dance in her 19th year, introduced by a mutual family friend who had in fact been quietly engineering the introduction for some weeks beforehand, and their courtship proceeded along lines that were, for their social class and period, considered appropriately measured, supervised visits, carefully chaperoned outings, an engagement announced only after Charles's family had conducted what amounted to a thorough, if discreetly handled, investigation into Augusta's own family background and financial standing, a process Augusta found, at 19, faintly humiliating even as she understood it as simply the accepted shape of how marriages at this level were properly arranged. 15 years into that marriage now, and her feelings about it, if you asked her honestly on a quiet night like this one, would turn out to be considerably more complicated than the smooth, composed surface she presents at dinner parties might suggest. There is real affection between them, built up gradually over a decade and a half of shared children and shared social challenges weathered as a genuine team. There is also, underneath that affection, a clear-eyed awareness on Augusta's part that the marriage was, from its very first introduction at that supervised dance, as much a careful financial and social transaction as it was a love story, an awareness she has made a kind of peace with over the years without ever fully setting it aside. Here is a small detail I have been saving, because I think it belongs near the end of tonight's story rather than buried somewhere in the middle, and it is this. Augusta Lathrop and Sadie's family are connected by a thread neither one of them will ever consciously recognize, a thread running directly through that settlement house where Esther attends her Thursday sewing class. Augusta has sat for the past 3 years on a small charitable committee organized by several women of her social circle specifically to fund and support precisely this kind of settlement work across the Lower East Side, a fashionable and genuinely well-regarded form of charitable involvement among wealthy women of this period, equal parts sincere social conscience and a recognized, almost expected component of a woman's broader social role at this level of society. She attends quarterly committee meetings, reviews modest budget reports, and twice now has actually visited a settlement house in person as part of an organized tour for committee members, dressed carefully for the occasion in something presentable but not ostentatious, careful, as the other women on the tour were equally careful, not to appear as though flaunting wealth in front of the very families the visit was meant to help. She has never visited the particular settlement house Esther attends, and even if she had, the two of them would have had no occasion to actually meet or speak, Augusta moving through such visits primarily in conversation with the settlement house's professional staff, rather than with the children and families using its services directly. But the money that pays for the modest sewing supplies Esther uses on Thursday afternoons, the salary of the kind, patient volunteer teaching that class, the very existence of a warm, dry room a few blocks from Hester Street, where Esther can spend an afternoon learning a skill in pleasant company, traces back, through several intermediate steps, to a portion of the considerable Lathrop family fortune, redirected through exactly this kind of careful, fashionable, sincerely intended charitable channel. I find something genuinely moving in that fact, and also something a little sad both at once. The way so much of tonight's story has asked you to hold two true things simultaneously, rather than settling for one simple, clean conclusion. These two women, separated by every measure of daily experience we have spent tonight examining, water hauled by hand versus water arriving instantly hot from a basement boiler, are nonetheless connected, however invisibly, by an actual flow of resources moving quietly from one world into the other, a flow that helped Esther in a small but real way, even though Esther will likely grow into adulthood without ever knowing precisely whose money made that Thursday afternoon class possible, and even though Augusta will go to her own grave without ever learning the name of even one of the specific children her committee's careful budget reports actually helped. That is perhaps simply how a city this size works then and now. Connection without contact, consequence without acquaintance. An entire elaborate, mostly invisible circulatory system carrying small amounts of comfort and opportunity from one unequal corner of the city into another, not nearly enough to close the gap between Hester Street and Fifth Avenue in any meaningful structural sense, but enough in this one small case to put a few sewing needles and a length of fabric into a 9-year-old girl's hands on a quiet Thursday afternoon, which is itself, in its own modest way, something. I want to spend a few more minutes inside both of these homes before we let the night take over completely, because there are a handful of smaller rooms and smaller habits we have not yet looked at closely enough, and I think they round out the picture in a way that matters. Let's start with the furniture itself, because the actual objects filling each home tell their own quiet version of this story. In Sadie's front room, there is a single wardrobe, second-hand, bought from a neighbor who moved to Brooklyn 2 years ago. Its door slightly warped so that it never quite closes flush, holding nearly every garment the family owns. There is the table where the family eats and where Sadie does her piecework, 4 mismatched chairs gathered over the years from wherever a chair happened to be affordable, and a small framed photograph on the wall, the one possession in the apartment that Sadie would say without hesitation she could not bear to lose, a portrait taken shortly before she and Morris left for America, showing her own mother and father standing stiffly in front of a painted backdrop, formal and unsmiling in the manner everyone adopted for photographs in that era, 2 faces she has not seen in person for 4 years, and, though she does not let herself dwell on it often, may very well never see again. There is also, tucked into a corner of the kitchen, a small shelf holding the family's few books, a worn prayer book that belonged to Morris's father, a handful of Yiddish pamphlets, and a single English primer that Sadie bought from a peddler specifically to help herself improve her reading, working through it slowly in the rare quiet stretches of an evening, sounding out words the same patient way Morris sounds out the newspaper. The two of them building their fluency in this new language side by side, neither one quite catching up to the other, both of them better at it than they were a year ago. The Lathrop house, by obvious contrast, contains an entire library, a dedicated room lined floor to ceiling with shelves holding several hundred volumes, leather-bound histories and novels, and an extensive set of encyclopedias purchased specifically for Edmund and Beatrice's education, along with a handsome writing desk where Charles conducts whatever correspondence he brings home from the office. Augusta reads regularly, novels mostly, borrowed from a small private lending library her social circle maintains among themselves, passing favoured titles from house to house with notes tucked inside the front cover recommending or warning against particular chapters. An informal book club of sorts conducted entirely through these handwritten margin notes rather than any actual scheduled meeting. She has in fact been working her way through a popular new novel this very week, reading a chapter most evenings before sleep, and there is something I find quietly amusing about the fact that this particular small nightly ritual, a tired woman reading a few pages before drifting off, looks almost identical whether the woman in question is surrounded by gas lamps and 400 leather-bound volumes, or by a single kerosene flame and a worn English primer bought from a peddler. The scale of the library differs enormously, The simple human comfort of a few quiet pages before sleep does not differ nearly as much. Birthdays too reveal something worth pausing on. Edmund turned 10 just last month, and the occasion was marked with a proper children's party. Perhaps a dozen carefully selected young guests from families within the Lathrop's own social circle, games organised in the drawing room under Miss Carrow's supervision, a cake commissioned specially from a confectioner 2 streets over, decorated elaborately enough that it required its own dedicated delivery by carriage, and gifts that included, among other things, a model sailboat with a genuinely functional rigging system and a leather-bound set of adventure novels that Edmund has already, by his mother's quiet pride, read through twice. Esther's 9th birthday, which fell this past autumn, looked considerably different, though I want to be careful not to frame it only as absence, because that would miss something true about how it actually felt from the inside. There was no party in any formal sense, no guest list, no commissioned cake. There was instead a small sweet bun that Sadie managed to buy from the bakery that particular morning, a rare treat reserved specifically for this one occasion. And there was a hair ribbon, carefully chosen and saved for over several weeks from whatever small spare change Sadie could set aside, wrapped in a scrap of paper since there was no spare money for proper wrapping paper either. Esther wore that ribbon to school the following Monday with a pride that, by every account Sadie could later give of that particular morning, rivaled anything Edmund felt unwrapping his model sailboat 3 miles north. The scale of the gift was almost laughably different. The intensity of the joy it produced, as far as either mother could tell from watching her own child's face, was not. Saturday mornings bring their own particular rhythm to the Hester Street apartment, the one true day of rest in a week otherwise built almost entirely around labour. Morris walks to the small synagogue 2 blocks over, taking Hyman with him now that the boy is old enough to sit properly through the service, the 2 of them joining perhaps 60 or 70 other men and boys from the immediate neighbourhood, in a room that is by any architectural measure plain and unremarkable, a converted storefront rather than any grand purpose-built structure, and yet filled every single Saturday morning with a depth of communal feeling that has nothing whatsoever to do with the modesty of its walls. Sadie does not attend services in quite the same regular way, the demands of a household with 3 children rarely permitting it, though she keeps the day itself sacred in her own fashion. No piecework touched, no needle lifted, the one full day each week when her hands, so constantly busy across the other 6, are finally permitted to simply rest. There is no equivalent weekly rhythm in the Lathrop household. No single day set apart with quite this same totality, since Sunday, as we discussed earlier, still leaves room for social calls and the management of correspondence, even if it excuses Augusta from the heaviest of her weekday social obligations. I think this is one more small place where the comparison refuses to settle into a clean conclusion. Sadie's week contains a single day of genuine, complete rest that the Lathrop household, for all its wealth and all its servants, simply does not build into its own rhythm in quite the same uncompromising way. A small, specific kind of richness belonging entirely to Hester Street, present in no comparable form on Fifth Avenue at all. Before we let this night settle all the way into stillness, I want to widen the frame just slightly one more time. There is one more sense worth lingering on before we move to sound, and that is smell, because the particular smell of each kitchen, more than almost any other single detail, is the thing former residents of either world tend to describe most vividly decades later when asked to remember it. Sadie's kitchen smells, on an ordinary evening, of coal smoke first, underneath everything else, a smell so constant it has become invisible to her the way most permanent smells eventually do. Over that sits onion frying in a little rendered fat, the sharp tang of vinegar from a jar of pickled cucumbers kept on the shelf, and on wash days the wet wool and lye soap smell that fills the apartment for hours afterward. On Fridays all of that gives way, however briefly, to the warm, yeasty smell of challah rising and then baking, a smell so specific to that one day of the week that Esther, even decades into her own adult life, would later say that smell alone could return her instantly to this exact kitchen, this exact age, this exact mother standing at this exact stove. The Lathrop kitchen smells considerably more varied, shifting almost daily depending on what Mrs. Hennessy or the visiting French chef happen to be preparing. Butter and cream where Sadie's kitchen relies on rendered fat, delicate herbs purchased specifically for a single dish rather than the same handful of staples stretched across an entire week. The occasional sharp, unfamiliar scent of some imported spice or sauce base that even Mrs. Hennessy herself only half recognizes when the French chef brings his own private stores along for a major dinner. Augusta rarely visits the kitchen itself, smelling these things mostly second-hand, drifting up the back stairs and through closed doors, a pleasant abstract sense that something delicious is underway somewhere she does not need to think about directly. I want to give you the actual sound of both of these streets too, before we move any further into the night, because sound, more than almost anything else, is what separates these two worlds in the moment-to-moment texture of simply existing inside them. Hester Street, at nearly any hour of the working day, is loud in a way that never really lets up. Pushcart vendors calling out their prices in overlapping waves of Yiddish and Italian and English, a rhythmic, almost musical cacophony that Sadie has stopped consciously hearing the way a person near a waterfall eventually stops consciously hearing the water. Horses pulling delivery carts clop unevenly over uneven cobblestones. Somewhere, nearly always, a child is crying, and somewhere else, nearly always, another child is laughing. The two sounds layered so constantly into the background of daily life that distinguishing one from the other requires a kind of attention nobody in this neighborhood actually spends on it. Through open windows in warmer months, and even through closed ones in the depth of winter, drift fragments of other families' conversations, an argument 2 floors down, a mother singing softly to a fussy infant, a phonograph somewhere playing a popular tune at a volume that suggests its owner is rather proud of having one at all. At night, the volume drops but never fully disappears. A late shift worker's footsteps on the stairs, a baby's cry rising and then settling, the particular creak of this specific building's particular old wood contracting in the cold, a sound Sadie could likely identify blindfolded after 4 years of falling asleep to it. Fifth Avenue offers an almost entirely different soundscape, not silent exactly, but muffled, curated, filtered through thick walls and heavy drapery and a considerable physical distance between the family's living spaces and the street itself. The clop of carriage horses passing outside registers as a pleasant, distant rhythm, rather than the constant immediate presence it represents on Hester Street. Inside the house, sound is managed almost as deliberately as everything else. Voices kept low in the formal rooms, servants trained specifically to move and work without unnecessary noise. The entire architecture of the house, with its separate staircases and its thick walls between family rooms and service areas, designed in part to keep the labor of the household audibly as well as visually separate from the family's own experience of their home. Augusta has remarked more than once to close friends that she finds a certain kind of silence in her own house faintly unsettling on the rare occasions she notices it at all. An emptiness in the air that a busier, louder household might fill more naturally, though she has never quite been able to articulate this feeling clearly enough to do anything about it. Nor would the structure of her own life, with its careful spacing between herself and her own children, easily allow for the kind of constant ambient noise that fills Sadie's apartment from 5 in the morning until well past dark. Let me leave you, before the night fully closes in, with one more small image from each household, a private moment between husband and wife that neither family's broader social performance ever quite reveals. After the children are asleep on Hester Street, Sadie and Morris sometimes sit together for a few minutes at the kitchen table before they too finally give in to exhaustion, not talking about anything of particular consequence, just the small accumulated details of the day, a price that crept up at the pushcart market, a phrase Hyman picked up at school that made them both laugh, a worry about next month's rent voiced quietly, and then set down again because voicing it changes nothing about it. Morris sometimes takes her hand across the table in these moments, his own hands rough and a little scarred from the iron, hers raw from the washboard and the lye soap, two tired pairs of hands resting together for a few minutes in the lamplight, before the lamp itself gets extinguished and the apartment goes properly dark. There is no grand romance performed in this gesture, nothing either of them would think to describe in those terms. There is simply a quiet, steady fact of two people who chose each other, crossed an ocean together, and are still, after everything, choosing each other every single exhausted evening, one tired hand resting over another. Up on Fifth Avenue, Charles sometimes comes to Augusta's room after the household has gone fully quiet, not every night, but often enough that it has become its own small, unremarked rhythm in their marriage, and the two of them talk, in these private hours, with a frankness that neither one quite permits themselves anywhere else in the day, about a business worry Charles cannot voice at his own dinner table, about a small social slight Augusta noticed at this evening's gathering that she has been turning over in her mind ever since, about Edmund's recent moodiness, about whether Beatrice's governess is in fact the right fit for her much longer. These conversations rarely solve anything outright, but they function in their own way as the one place in either of their days where the performance required by every other hour gets set down entirely, two tired people speaking honestly to each other in a dim room while the rest of the house, family and staff alike, finally sleeps around them. Different rooms, different hands, different worries voiced in the quiet dark at the end of an exhausting day. The same simple, stubborn fact of two people, in each case still reaching for each other after everything the day has already asked of them. Neither Sadie's building nor Augusta Street holds only the two families we have spent tonight following, and I think a quick glance at who else shares these walls adds something honest to the picture before we let the night take over completely. 2 floors below Sadie, in an apartment slightly smaller than her own, lives a family who arrived from Italy only this past year, a husband who found work almost immediately on a construction crew helping to dig those very subway tunnels we mentioned earlier, and a wife, considerably less fluent in English than Sadie has become after her own 4 years in the city, who takes in boarders, 2 unmarried young men also recently arrived, sleeping on pallets in the kitchen each night in exchange for a few dollars a month that make the difference, for this particular family, between making rent and falling behind. Sadie and this neighbor exchange polite greetings on the stairs, share the occasional small kindness, a borrowed cup of flour, a watchful eye kept on each other's children playing in the hallway, but the language gap keeps any deeper friendship from forming easily. The two households existing side by side in the same building, sharing the same water tap and the same air shaft, without ever quite becoming close in the way Sadie is close with the 2 Yiddish-speaking women on her own floor. On the top floor, in the smallest and cheapest apartment in the building, lives an elderly widow named Mrs. Abramowitz, who has been in this country for over 20 years, considerably longer than nearly anyone else on this block, and who supports herself entirely through piecework now that her own children have grown and scattered to other neighborhoods, sending her a few dollars when they can, but rarely enough to lift her circumstances much above what her own needle and thread provide. Sadie checks on her every few days, brings her a portion of whatever the family is eating when there is enough to spare, a small informal system of mutual care that runs through this entire building and this entire neighborhood, invisible to anyone outside it, utterly essential to nearly everyone inside it. Up on Fifth Avenue, the Lathrop house sits between 2 other substantial residences, one belonging to a family whose fortune, built in railroads 2 generations earlier, somewhat exceeds even the Lathrops' own considerable means, and another belonging to a family of comparable standing to Charles and Augusta's, with whom the Lathrops maintain a friendly, carefully calibrated social relationship, built on years of overlapping dinner invitations and shared committee work. Augusta knows the women in both neighboring households well, has tea with one of them most weeks, exchanges the kind of detailed, attentive social intelligence with both of them that functions, in this rarefied world, almost like a private information network, who is engaged, who is in financial difficulty despite outward appearances, whose daughter has developed an unfortunate attachment that the family is quietly working to discourage. This network matters enormously to how smoothly Augusta's own social life functions, an entire invisible web of mutual surveillance and mutual support running along this stretch of avenue exactly the way Sadie's own informal network runs along her tenement floor, structurally similar in function even as it operates in a completely different register of consequence and stakes. I point this out because I think it matters this final time to resist seeing either Sadie or Augusta as isolated figures standing alone against the backdrop of their respective struggles. Both women exist inside dense, overlapping communities of mutual obligation and mutual care, women checking on each other, sharing what little or what much they have, watching each other's children, exchanging information that helps each other find a way through an often difficult world a little more successfully than either one could manage entirely alone. That too is a kind of wealth, distributed considerably more evenly across this city than money itself ever was. And I think it deserves a place in tonight's story before we let everything finally go quiet. There is one more living presence in both of these worlds I have not yet mentioned, and I think it deserves a place here before we turn to the numbers, because the city's animals lived through their own version of the same divide we have been tracing all night between these two households. Down on Hester Street, a cat without any particular owner has taken up residence in the building's rear yard, fed in scraps by whichever tenant happens to have something to spare that day, tolerated by the landlord mainly because she keeps the yard's modest rat population from growing any larger than it already has. Esther has named her privately something soft and affectionate that she has never quite admitted to her mother, and leaves a small portion of whatever the family is eating set out near the water tap most evenings. A quiet, unofficial kindness extended toward a creature that belongs to nobody and, in its own scrappy way, to everybody on this floor at once. The horses that pull the delivery carts and the pushcart vendors' own smaller wagons through this neighborhood live considerably harder lives than that cat does, worked long hours over cobblestones that are unforgiving on hooves and joints alike, fed whatever modest ration their owner can afford, which on the poorer end of this trade is not always quite enough. There are reformers in this city in this very period, beginning to organize specifically around the treatment of working horses, distributing water at public troughs positioned at busy intersections, lobbying for basic standards of rest and feed that a number of cart owners simply cannot meet given how thin their own margins run. A small reform movement running in close parallel in its underlying logic to the housing reform efforts we discussed earlier, both of them attempts to set some kind of floor beneath suffering that pure market pressure left to its own devices had shown little inclination to address on its own. 3 miles north, the Lathrop stables hold 4 horses, 2 for the carriage Patrick drives and 2 held in reserve for riding, groomed daily by a stable hand whose entire job consists of their care, fed a carefully managed diet appropriate to their work, exercised regularly, housed in stalls considerably cleaner and more spacious than the rear yard the Hester Street cat calls home. These are, by any reasonable measure, fortunate animals, cared for with a thoroughness that the cart horses pulling vegetable wagons through the Lower East Side rarely receive. One more small, quiet illustration of how completely an animal's experience of this city, like a human family's, could be shaped by which household happened to own it. And there is a dog, too, in the Lathrop household, a small, fashionably groomed lapdog belonging specifically to Beatrice, a gift from an aunt 2 birthdays ago, who sleeps on a cushion in the nursery and is walked twice daily by whichever footman happens to have a free quarter hour, a creature whose entire existence is organized around comfort and affection, in a way that mirrors almost uncomfortably closely if you sit with it for a moment the broader pattern of care and resource running through this entire household, extended even to its pets with a thoroughness that few families anywhere in the city, of any class, could afford to extend to their own children, let alone an animal. I don't point this out to suggest anything unkind about Beatrice's evident affection for her dog, which is genuine and sweet and exactly the kind of attachment any 7-year-old might form. I point it out because the gap between that lapdog's daily care and the daily existence of the nameless cat in Sadie's rear yard is in its own small way a strangely precise miniature of the entire gap we have spent tonight examining between the two households these animals happen to belong to. A gap that apparently extended itself, without anyone particularly intending it to, even down to which creatures got to sleep on a cushion and which crept out at dusk to take their chances on whatever scraps a tired, generous 9-year-old happened to set aside near the water tap. Now a few actual numbers, because I promised you at the start that tonight would stay educational even as it grows quieter, and I think these particular figures crystallize something that all of tonight's scenes taken individually only gesture toward. Morris brings home in a typical week somewhere in the neighborhood of $9 or $10 for his 11-hour days at the pressing shop, 6 days running. Sadie's piecework adds perhaps another $1.50 on a good week, less when Dora's demands cut too deeply into the hours available for sewing. Out of that combined total, rent on the apartment takes close to $3, an amount that has crept upward twice in the 4 years they have lived there despite no improvement whatsoever in the apartment itself. Coal for the stove runs close to $1 in a cold month. Food for 5 people, even managed as carefully as Sadie manages it, rarely costs less than $3 or $4 across a full week. What remains, once rent and coal and food are accounted for, is a thin margin of perhaps $1.50 to $2 for absolutely everything else a household might need across an entire week: shoes, medicine, a Sabbath indulgence, the occasional vaudeville ticket, any small emergency that might arise without warning. There is in most weeks nothing left over at all once that margin gets spent, and in a bad week the margin runs negative, drawn down from whatever small reserve happens to be sitting in that tin box on the high shelf. Now set that against the Lathrop household, where Charles's income from his banking interests runs into the tens of thousands of dollars annually, a figure so far beyond Morris's roughly $500 a year that the two numbers become difficult to hold in the mind side by side without the comparison starting to feel almost abstract, more like comparing different units of measurement than different amounts of the same currency. The claret silk dress Augusta wore to 2 dinners this week alone likely cost somewhere between $30 and $50 to have made, a single garment representing close to a full month of Morris's entire household income. The ball gown currently being pinned and fitted, with its 20 yards of silk and its hand beading, will likely run considerably higher than that once finished, perhaps close to what Morris earns across an entire half year of 11-hour days. I am not laying these figures out to provoke outrage exactly, though I think a little discomfort sitting alongside the numbers is honest and appropriate. I am laying them out because I think specific figures do something that general descriptions of inequality cannot quite manage on their own. They make the gap concrete, countable, impossible to soften into vague impression. $1.50 of weekly margin against a single dress costing a half year's wages. That is not a difference of degree. It is closer to a difference of entire economic universes occupying the very same 3 miles of Manhattan Island. And there is one more small object I want to mention before we return to the quiet, because I think it says something neither set of numbers quite manages to say on its own. In the pocket of Sadie's apron, every single day sits a small folded scrap of paper on which she has written, in her own careful, still slightly uncertain English, a running tally of exactly what she has spent that week and exactly what remains, updated and corrected throughout each day, because the margin is thin enough that she genuinely cannot afford to lose track of it even for a single afternoon. In Augusta's beaded evening reticule, hanging from her wrist at tonight's dinner, sits a small leather card case holding her calling cards, a delicate enamelled compact, and a folded handkerchief edged in lace. No money at all, because a woman of her standing is simply never expected to carry or handle currency directly in any social setting. That particular function handled, like so many others in her life, by someone else entirely, generally Charles, or occasionally Mr. Pratt, on her behalf. 2 small bags, 2 entirely different relationships to money itself, one defined by constant, exhausting vigilance over every single coin, the other defined by such complete and seamless removal from the handling of money that the very idea of needing to track it personally would strike its owner as faintly strange. Let's slow all the way down now, because I think we have earned it, both of us, after everything we have walked through together tonight. And I want to spend these last stretches simply sitting inside the quiet of this particular New York night, rather than introducing anything new at all. Picture the snow again, because it has not stopped, not really, just thinned into something closer to a fine scattered drift, the kind that barely seems to be falling at all until you watch a single flake catch the light from a gas lamp and trace its slow path all the way down to the pavement. It has been falling for hours now over both of these homes, settling in the same quiet, patient way over the narrow ledge outside Sadie's kitchen window and over the wide stone sill outside Augusta's bedroom. A soft white accumulation that does not know the difference, has never known the difference, between 400 square feet and 4 entire floors, between a coal stove fought into life with cold fingers and a boiler tended through the night by a man dozing in a worn wooden chair. Inside the tenement, the apartment holds its hard-won warmth a little longer than you might expect, the stove's last heat still faintly present in the iron even hours after the fire itself has gone out. The whole small space settled into a kind of held-breath quiet, broken only by the soft, even sound of 5 people breathing in their sleep, Dora's breath the quickest and lightest of them, a small steady rhythm against her mother's side, Morris's breath slower and deeper, the particular heavy sleep of a body that worked 11 hours pressing hot iron against fabric and has, for these few hours at least, nothing at all left to give. Outside their one window, Hester Street itself has gone almost entirely still, the last pushcart vendor long since wheeled away, the gas lamp at the corner burning its steady orange against the falling snow, casting long, soft shadows up the brick fronts of buildings that, in daylight, never look quite this peaceful, this hushed, this strangely, briefly beautiful. 3 miles north, the Lathrop house holds its own different quality of stillness, thicker, more padded, sound itself seeming to move more slowly through rooms with high ceilings and heavy drapery, and carpet thick enough to absorb a footstep almost entirely. Augusta sleeps in a bed considerably larger than any single piece of furniture on Hester Street, beneath linens laundered that very week by Margaret Doyle in the basement 2 floors below, the room warmed steadily and invisibly by a boiler that never once across this entire long night requires her conscious attention. Down in that basement, the night fireman feeds the fire one more time, checks the gauge and allows himself finally a longer stretch of sleep in his worn wooden chair, confident the house above him will hold its warmth now until nearly dawn. If you could somehow rise up above both of these buildings right now, high enough to see the whole shape of the city laid out beneath the falling snow, I think what you would notice first is not the difference between them at all, not at this exact hour, not from this particular height. You would notice instead how much they resemble each other, 2 clusters of small lit and unlit windows scattered across a vast dark grid of streets, both of them holding sleeping families, both of them surrounded by the same softly falling snow, both of them part of the same single enormous, breathing city stretching out in every direction toward rivers on either side, bridges beginning even now to be strung across one of them, ferries waiting at their docks, the elevated trains finally quiet on their iron rails until the first run resumes in just a few hours. This is, I think, the image I most want to leave you with tonight, more than any single statistic about wages or square footage or the relative cost of a silk gown against an entire year of a presser's income, true and important as all of that has been. Not the differences, though we have looked at the differences honestly and at length, because pretending they were small would have done a disservice to both Sadie and Augusta, to the real hardship of one life and the real, if differently shaped, weight of the other. But this instead, 2 homes, 3 miles apart, both finally quiet after an enormously long day, both holding people who worked in their own entirely different registers, exhaustingly hard to get through that day successfully, both now resting beneath the exact same softly falling snow, in the exact same patient dark, waiting for the exact same sun to eventually rise over the exact same city tomorrow morning. There is a kind of comfort in that image, I think, the kind that does not erase or minimize anything real about inequality, about hardship, about how unevenly this particular city, like every city before and since, chose to distribute its comforts among the people living inside it. But it is a comfort nonetheless, and I think it is the right note to end on, because beneath every difference we walked through together tonight, the water hauled by hand and the water arriving silently hot, the 400 square feet and the 4 floors, the coal stove fought into life each morning, and the boiler tended through the night by an unseen, unthanked man in a basement, there remains this single, simple, durable fact. Both of these households were full of people trying, in whatever way their particular circumstances allowed, to build something warm, something safe, something worth calling home, inside a city that had given each of them a wildly different set of tools to work with, and had asked of each of them a different kind of exhausting daily effort in return. Sadie will wake again in a few hours, before the sun, and fight the cold stove back to life one more time, the way she has done every single morning for 4 years and will likely continue doing for many years yet to come. And there is something in that simple continuity, that quiet daily renewal of effort, that I find myself genuinely admiring the longer I sit with it. Augusta will wake a little later, and Bridget will already be moving quietly through the dressing room, and the leather notebook on the writing desk will already hold the shape of tomorrow's careful, demanding, invisible labour, of appearing to do no labour at all. Both mornings will begin again, almost exactly as this one did, and somewhere in that exact repetition, that patient, unremarked, daily beginning again, is most of what an ordinary life in 1900 actually was, for nearly everyone living it, on every single street in this entire enormous city. The snow keeps falling, gently now, over Hester Street and over Fifth Avenue both, over rooftops where families once slept through the worst of August's heat, and over a basement where one tired man kept watch over a fire all night, so an entire household upstairs would never have to think about cold at all. It falls over the East River and over the construction barriers marking out tunnels for trains that have not yet begun to run, and over the gas lamps that will, within another decade or two, themselves begin disappearing from these same streets in favour of electric light. The whole slow, uneven, endlessly complicated machinery of progress grinding forward, a little faster in some neighbourhoods than others, the way it always seems to, the way it perhaps always will, and somewhere underneath all of that falling snow, in 2 homes 3 miles apart, in 100 other homes scattered between and beyond them that we did not have time to visit tonight, but that were each one living through some version of this very same complicated, unequal, deeply human Tuesday, the city simply rests, for these few quiet hours, the way it rests every single night, regardless of what the next morning will eventually demand of everyone inside it. I think that is where I want to leave you tonight, my friend, here in this quiet, snowing dark, with both of these homes finally still, with the whole enormous city holding its breath for just these few hours before the milk wagons and the ice wagons and the first newsboys and the first footmen with their morning trays all begin their work again. Whatever your own evening has looked like tonight, wherever you are watching this from, however far from either Hester Street or Fifth Avenue your own particular life happens to sit, I hope something in these 2 homes found its way to you, settled somewhere quiet inside you the way this snow has settled over both of these rooftops, soft and even and entirely without judgment about which side of any line it happened to land on. Sleep well tonight. Let the rest of this night be as quiet for you as it finally became for Sadie, and for Augusta, and for everyone else in this old, enormous, unequal, endlessly fascinating city, settling at last beneath the snow.